Get comfortable, settle in, maybe turn the lights down a little. Because for the next 4 hours, we're going to Springfield. Not the cheerful, sun-drenched Springfield of the opening credits, with its cheerful music and its couch gags and its familiar yellow faces. We're going somewhere deeper than that. We're going to the version of Springfield that hides underneath the jokes. The version that's been quietly building its case for 36 years, episode by episode, detail by detail, mystery by mystery, waiting for someone to sit still long enough to notice what it's actually been saying. The Simpsons is the longest-running animated series in the history of American television. 36 seasons, 788 episodes, decades of stories about the same family in the same house on the same street in the same impossible town. And in all that time, across all of that content, the show has accumulated something that most people have never stopped to examine. A web of buried mysteries, a network of unresolved storylines, a series of deeply strange details that the show drops into frame and then never mentions again, as if it's trusting you to notice them on your own and draw your own conclusions. Tonight, we're going to do exactly that. We're going to move slowly. We're going to take our time. We're going to let Springfield breathe around us and look at it with fresh eyes. And what we find when we do that, what the show has been quietly building toward for over 3 decades, is something far stranger, far darker, and in its own way far more beautiful than anything the show has ever said out loud. So let's begin. Let's start at the very foundation of everything strange about Springfield. Let's start with the thing that explains everything else, if you're willing to follow the logic all the way to its conclusion. Let's start with the power plant. Section 1. The nuclear power plant and the mutation of Springfield. There is a building that sits at the edge of Springfield. You've seen it thousands of times if you've watched this show. It appears in the opening credits, 2 enormous cooling towers rising against the sky. Their silhouettes so familiar by now that most people stopped actually looking at them somewhere around season 3. They're just part of the scenery, part of the furniture, part of the landscape of a town that most people treat as a comfortable, familiar place. But the Springfield nuclear power plant is not a comfortable thing. It is not a safe thing, and the more carefully you examine the evidence the show has been laying out across 36 seasons, the clearer it becomes that the plant isn't just a workplace or a background detail or a source of jokes about safety violations. It is the explanation for everything. Let's establish the facts first because the facts alone are extraordinary. The Springfield nuclear power plant is a 2-unit pressurized water reactor facility. It is owned and operated by Charles Montgomery Burns, a man whose age the show places, conservatively, somewhere well past 100 years old. The plant is the primary source of electrical power for the entire town of Springfield. Every home, every business, every school, every hospital in town draws its power from those 2 cooling towers. The town is economically dependent on the plant in the most fundamental possible way. Without the plant, Springfield ceases to function. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it means something important. It means that every resident of Springfield has a personal stake in the continued operation of the plant. Not just the people who work there, not just the people who live directly downwind, but every single person in town. Their lights run on plant power. Their heat runs on plant power. The school their children attend, the hospital where they receive treatment, the businesses where they work. All of it connected back to those 2 cooling towers. The town and the plant are not separate things. They are one system, with Burns at the center of it. And every resident of Springfield is downstream of whatever comes out of that facility. Now let's talk about what comes out of it. A surprise safety inspection of the Springfield nuclear power plant, depicted across multiple episodes of the show, found 342 violations. 342 separate instances of dangerous, reckless, negligent practice at a facility designed to manage one of the most destructive forces in human history. The estimated cost to bring the plant into compliance with even basic safety standards was $56 million. And Charles Montgomery Burns, a man whose personal fortune is described across various episodes as running into the billions, refused to suspend it. He didn't refuse because he couldn't afford it. He refused because spending the money would mean acknowledging that the violations existed. And acknowledging that the violations existed would mean someone might start asking questions. questions about what those violations had already done, what they had already leaked, what they had already contaminated, what they had already done to the air and the water and the soil of the town that had been living in the shadow of those cracked cooling towers for decades. The violations themselves are not minor. This is important to understand. We're not talking about paperwork errors. We're not talking about outdated fire extinguishers or unlabeled storage closets. The show depicts radioactive waste being dumped directly into bodies of water that Springfield residents fish in and drink from. Radioactive material being deposited on children's playgrounds. Plutonium being used casually as a paperweight on an employee's desk. Sitting there in the open air, radiating its invisible damage into anyone who comes near it. Cooling towers held together with chewing gum. Rats running through the facility that glow visibly in darkness. Their biology so contaminated by proximity to the reactor that their own bodies have become radioactive. And then there is the detail that the show drops once, quietly, in the background of a scene and never returns to. Human skeletons in the basement. Not props, not decoration. Human skeletons in the basement of an active nuclear power plant. The show presents them, the camera acknowledges them, and then the episode moves on. Nobody in Springfield asks who those people were. Nobody investigates. Nobody files a report. The safety inspector responsible for catching exactly this kind of thing looks at a room full of human remains in a nuclear facility and apparently notes it as one of 342 violations and moves on with his clipboard. And that brings us to the safety inspector himself. Because the man whose literal job it is to stand between Springfield and radioactive catastrophe, the man whose professional responsibility is to ensure that none of this leaks out into the town, is Homer Simpson. Homer Simpson, a man whose IQ the show's own creator has stated is approximately 55. A man who, as revealed in a memorable Season 12 episode, has had a crayon lodged in his brain since childhood, physically and mechanically reducing his cognitive function for his entire adult life. A man who sleeps regularly at his workstation. A man who once caused a nuclear incident by throwing a donut into the reactor core to see if it would grow bigger. A man who, by the show's own accounting, has made 742 documented errors in his professional capacity, each one of which should, under any rational system of employment, have resulted in his immediate termination. Homer is not just bad at his job. Homer is catastrophically, historically, legendarily bad at his job. And he has been doing that job, or failing to do it, for the entirety of his adult life. This is the situation. A plant with 342 violations. An owner who refuses to fix them. A safety inspector whose brain is physically impaired. And a town that has been drinking the water, breathing the air, and eating the fish downstream from all of it for decades. Now let's look at what the show says happened to Springfield as a result. In Season 2 of the show, a fisherman pulls something unusual from a river near the power plant. It's a fish. Specifically, it's a three-eyed fish, which the episode names Blinky. Blinky becomes national news within the show's universe. A gubernatorial candidate uses Blinky as the centerpiece of an argument that Burns is poisoning the local environment. The story gets enough traction that Burns is forced to appear on live television and eat the fish to demonstrate its safety. He sits down, he takes a bite, he smiles for the cameras, and the town watches and moves on. Nobody conducts a follow-up study, nobody tests the water table, nobody looks at a visibly mutated fish pulled from a river downstream from an actively leaking nuclear facility, and thinks to ask the obvious question, which is, if the fish have three eyes, what is happening to the people drinking from the same water? The answer, it turns out, has been visible in every single frame of the show since its very first episode. You just have to look at the residents themselves. Homer Simpson. Let's look at Homer carefully, with fresh eyes, as if we're seeing him for the first time. He has a skull shape that does not conform to human biology. His overbite is severe enough to qualify as a structural abnormality. His eyes bulge from their sockets in a manner that no medical professional would describe as normal. He has 4 fingers on each hand, not 5. 4. And his body, despite being subjected to physical trauma that would kill a normal human being multiple times over, heals at a rate that defies biological explanation. The show has depicted Homer being shot, electrocuted, falling from cliffs, being struck by cars, surviving explosions, being crushed, burned, battered, and broken in ways that should be fatal. And every time he recovers. Not just survives, recovers, walks away, shows up the next day. His body absorbs damage that would be lethal to any normally functioning organism, and it bounces back as if nothing happened. Marge Simpson. The same bulging eyes, the same 4 fingers. Hair that defies not just aesthetic convention, but the laws of physics, growing straight upward in a perfect tower that has maintained its exact shape for 36 years without any visible structural support. Marge was briefly employed at the plant herself. She was in that facility. She was exposed to whatever is in those walls and those vents and that water, and their children. Bart, Lisa, Maggie, all born in Springfield, all raised in Springfield, all drinking the same water, breathing the same air, living in the shadow of those cooling towers every day of their lives. And every one of them displays physical characteristics that do not appear in normal human populations. The hair that maintains impossible shapes without product. The overbites, the eyes, and the skin. That yellow skin. Every resident of Springfield has the same yellow skin. Not a slightly warm complexion, not a gentle tan. Yellow. The specific, saturated, impossible yellow of a body that has been altered in some fundamental way. And here's the detail that makes this theory click into something that is very hard to dismiss. When guest characters visit Springfield, when celebrities appear in episodes, when characters from outside the town arrive as visitors, they look different. Not slightly different. Fundamentally different. Their proportions are more natural, their eyes are more normally shaped, their features more closely resemble actual human anatomy. The show draws outsiders with more realistic proportions than it draws Springfield residents. Their skin is not yellow. The standard explanation for this, the one that most people have accepted without thinking too hard about it, is that it's just the art style. That's how The Simpsons looks. Yellow skin is part of the show's visual language. The guest characters look different because the show is acknowledging the contrast between its stylized world and the more realistic-looking visitors. But consider what that explanation actually means within the logic of the show's own universe. If we accept that the Simpsons universe is internally consistent, that the world depicted in Springfield operates according to its own rules, then there is a visible, observable, consistent difference between people who live inside Springfield and people who don't. The people inside the contamination zone have yellow skin, 4 fingers, bulging eyes, and abnormal physical proportions. The people who come from outside it look like normal human beings. The show is showing you the mutation. It has been showing you the mutation for 36 years. It dressed it up as an art style and trusted that nobody would look too closely. And the wildlife confirms it. The Simpson family dog, Santa's little helper, has the same bulging eyes as his owners. The same proportions that deviate from real canine anatomy. Birds in Springfield. Fish in Springfield. Every living organism in the show's universe that lives within the town displays the same biological deviations that the human residents display. Blinky the three-eyed fish is not an exception. Blinky is the show being explicit about what it has been depicting implicitly in every frame. This is what radiation does to living organisms in Springfield. This is what the plant has been doing to everything downstream of its leaking cooling towers. The show tells you this directly in clear, unambiguous terms with a three-eyed fish. And then it expects you to believe that the exact same radiation, leaking from the exact same facility, has had zero effect on the humans consuming the same contaminated environment. Unless the effect is what you've been looking at the whole time. Now let's talk about the man at the center of all of this, because Burns is not a passive figure in this story. The show makes it explicit across multiple episodes and multiple seasons that Charles Montgomery Burns understands exactly what his plant is doing to Springfield. He understands it because he is personally experiencing it in his own body. In the Season 8 episode known as The Springfield Files, Homer encounters something in the woods near Springfield that he initially takes for an alien. The entire town panics. FBI agents from a popular science fiction drama are called in to investigate. The episode builds through classic comedic beats toward a dramatic reveal. And when the truth finally comes out, the alien isn't an alien at all. It's Mr. Burns. Burns has been undergoing a weekly medical treatment so intensive, so loaded with chemicals and radiation therapy, that it causes his entire body to emit a visible green glow. The treatment keeps him alive for exactly 1 more week. Without it, he dies. The regimen is so extreme, so physiologically destabilizing, that after each session, Burns wanders out of the facility in a dazed and euphoric state, stumbling through the woods like a creature from a different world. He literally glows in the dark. That is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. Burns is so saturated with radiation treatment that his body emits visible light. And the people of Springfield encounter this glowing figure in the forest, and their first instinct is not radiation. It's not the plant. It's not the logical conclusion of the environment they have been living in for decades. Their first instinct is that it must be an alien from outer space. That is the depth of the denial. That is how completely the town has sealed itself off from the implications of what surrounds it. Burns is not unaware of any of this. Burns funds private medical research. He has personal physicians. He undergoes a carefully scheduled weekly intervention that has been maintaining his biological function for what appears to be, given his stated age and historical references, something approaching a century. Burns understands radiation better than anyone else in Springfield because radiation is the only thing keeping him alive. He understands what it does to biological systems because he has spent over a century managing its effects in his own body. He has a pharmaceutical infrastructure capable of synthesizing whatever he needs to maintain his particular form of radioactive equilibrium. And he has been deploying that understanding not just in the management of his own health, but in the management of Springfield. Consider Homer's employment. Homer should have been fired from the power plant hundreds of times. The show documents this explicitly. 742 errors. Any competent safety inspector would have shut that plant down within a week of taking the job. Homer ensures the violations continue. The radiation keeps leaking. The water stays contaminated. And Burns maintains his monopoly over Springfield's power supply, over its economy, and by extension over its entire population. When German investors briefly purchased the plant in one of the show's most memorable storylines, the very first thing they did was fire Homer. The second thing they did was assess the cost of bringing the facility up to code, and the estimate nearly drove them to financial ruin. They were desperate to get out. Burns bought the plant back and immediately rehired Homer. Not out of sentiment, not out of affection, out of strategic necessity. A competent safety inspector would shut the plant down. Homer ensures it stays open. The radiation keeps flowing, and the population downstream of those cracked cooling towers keeps drinking the water and breathing the air, and wondering why their fish have 3 eyes, too cognitively impaired, to make the connection between the facility that powers their homes and the biological abnormalities that have defined their lives. Because here is the darkest piece of the radiation theory. The same contamination that mutated the bodies of Springfield's residents has also damaged the part of their brains responsible for critical thinking. The show provides direct evidence for this in the Season 12 revelation, that Homer once had the crayon removed from his brain and his IQ skyrocketed to genius level. He became articulate, perceptive, capable of understanding the patterns of his own life for the first time. And what did he do with that clarity? He saw Springfield for what it really was. He saw his job for what it really was. He saw the architecture of his own suffering and found it unbearable. So he had the crayon put back in. He chose stupidity. He chose the fog. But the show never asked the question that the crayon story demands. How did a crayon end up in a child's brain in the first place without anyone noticing? How did Homer go through his entire childhood, his entire adolescence, his entire adult life, visiting doctors in Springfield, getting checkups in Springfield, and not a single medical professional ever found a foreign object in his skull? Either every doctor in Springfield is incompetent beyond any reasonable explanation, or someone knew it was there and chose not to remove it. And if the medical establishment in Springfield is compromised, if the healthcare system of the town is connected to the same infrastructure that Burns controls, then Homer's crayon is not just a physical object. It is a symbol the show is using to tell you something it cannot say directly. The people of Springfield have something wrong with their brains, something that keeps them docile and compliant and incapable of looking at those cracked cooling towers and asking the most fundamental question a conscious being can ask. Why are we all like this? The radiation theory does not explain one mystery about The Simpsons. It explains all of them. The characters don't age because their mutated biology has been altered at the cellular level. The town resets after catastrophic events because the population's cognitive function is compromised by chronic neurological damage. Homer survives injuries that should kill him because his body has adapted to radiation in ways that make him nearly indestructible while leaving him cognitively devastated. Burns stays alive through treatments that would destroy a normal human because he has spent over a century engineering his own radioactive equilibrium, with resources that nobody else in town has access to. And nobody in Springfield questions any of this because the same invisible poison that altered their bodies also damaged the part of their minds responsible for asking questions. Springfield is not a quirky cartoon town. Springfield is a contamination zone. The residents are not eccentric, they are symptomatic. And the nuclear power plant that dominates their skyline, that powers their homes, that employs their neighbors and poisons their water and irradiates their children is not a background detail. It is the cause. It has always been the cause. Every yellow face, every bulging eye, every impossible recovery from fatal injury, every forgotten catastrophe, every reset, every unexplained detail. All of it traces back to the same cracked cooling tower, leaking the same invisible damage into the same water supply, feeding the same compromised minds that cannot figure out why their fish have 3 eyes and their children have 4 fingers. The Springfield nuclear power plant is not just part of the show. It is the show, and nobody in Springfield will ever figure that out, because the plant already made sure they cannot. If you're settling in and enjoying this journey through Springfield, drop a comment below with your time and location. I love knowing where in the world people are watching from. And if you want more of this, subscribe. Now, let's go deeper. Section 2. Homer's Coma. The dream that never ended. There is a fan theory about The Simpsons that has been circulating since at least 2012, growing in detail and sophistication with each passing year, accumulating evidence and refining its arguments until it has become one of the most internally consistent interpretations of a television show ever assembled outside of an academic setting. The theory is called the Homer Coma theory, and it proposes something that, once you hear it, is very difficult to unhear. Homer Simpson has been in a coma since April 1993. Every episode of The Simpsons that aired after that date, every storyline, every character development, every celebrity appearance, every impossible event, every surreal adventure, every tender family moment is not the story of a real family living through real experiences. It is a dream. A long, elaborate, desperate dream being generated by the unconscious mind of a man lying in a hospital bed in Springfield General while his family sits by his side and waits for him to open his eyes. Let's go back to the beginning of this story because the setup matters. The episode in question aired on April 1st, 1993. It was the 18th episode of Season 4, and it was called So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. The premise was simple. Bart plays a series of increasingly elaborate April Fool's Day pranks on Homer. The escalation reaches its peak when Bart takes one of Homer's beers to an auto body shop and places it inside an industrial paint shaker. The can is agitated so violently that when Homer opens it, the explosion sends him to the hospital. So far, so Simpsons. Homer in the hospital for something ridiculous was already well within the show's established comic vocabulary by Season 4. But what happens next is different. Homer is lying in his hospital bed recovering from the explosion when he notices a vending machine across the room. He sees a candy bar he wants. He reaches for it. The machine tips over, it lands on him. And Homer Simpson flatlines. Not in a dream sequence, not in a Treehouse of Horror special. In a regular, canonical episode of the show, in the middle of what was otherwise a fairly standard clip show episode, Homer Simpson clinically dies. He enters a coma. He loses consciousness. And the episode makes a specific point of depicting this not as a joke with a punchline, but as a medical event with medical terminology and medical consequences. The episode ends with what looks like a resolution. Bart, tearfully at Homer's bedside, confesses that the whole thing was his fault. Homer springs awake and immediately starts strangling his son. The family laughs. Everything goes back to normal. The show tells you he woke up. The coma is over. Move on. But then the episode reveals something in its final moments that it never revisits and never explains. Homer lost 5% of his brain function during the coma. 5% gone. Destroyed permanently. Never coming back. And Homer's response to being told that he is now permanently brain damaged is to laugh. He specifically says he doesn't understand why he's laughing. And the family finds this charming. Nobody finds it alarming. Nobody asks follow-up questions. The episode ends, and The Simpsons continues for 32 more years as if nothing happened. The coma theory says nothing did happen. More precisely, it says that the resolution was itself part of the coma. That Homer never actually woke up. That the tearful bedside scene, the strangling, the laughter, the return to normal, all of it was the dream beginning. The unconscious mind of a man in a hospital bed, starting to weave the long, elaborate, beautiful, strange dream that would occupy the next 3 decades of episodes. Let's look at the evidence. Because the evidence is genuinely compelling, and it becomes more compelling the more carefully you examine it. The first piece of evidence is tonal, and it is the most immediately observable. The Simpsons before the coma episode and The Simpsons after the coma episode are tonally almost different shows. In the early seasons before April 1993, The Simpsons was a grounded show. Not realistic exactly. It was always a cartoon, always comedic, always willing to push things past the boundaries of plausibility for the sake of a joke. But its storylines dealt with recognizable human problems. Homer struggles with his weight and his self-image. He tries to quit drinking. He deals with financial stress, with job insecurity, with the particular anxiety of a man who feels like he is constantly failing at the things he most wants to succeed at. Marge considers the possibility that her marriage might be breaking down. Lisa develops a crush on a substitute teacher and learns the painful lesson of unrequited admiration. Bart struggles academically and faces the very real consequence of being held back a year in school. These are family stories. They're told through the lens of satire, absolutely, but their emotional core is rooted in experiences that real families have. Financial worry, marital tension, academic failure, the fear of not being enough. The show's emotional vocabulary in those early seasons was built on relatability. The Simpsons resonated because it depicted a version of family life that felt true even when it was absurd. The absurdity was always in service of something recognizable. After the coma, the show changes. Not gradually, sharply. The shift is not subtle, it is seismic. Homer goes to space. Homer joins a secret society. Homer discovers his mother is a radical fugitive. Homer meets God not once but twice in the span of a few seasons. Homer becomes the leader of a vigilante group. Homer befriends celebrities so numerous that the list reads like a particularly ambitious episode guide. Mr. Burns captures the Loch Ness Monster. The family travels to dozens of countries. Homer holds hundreds of different jobs, each one more implausible than the last. The physical comedy escalates beyond anything that could be described as grounded, with Homer surviving impacts and injuries that a platoon of Marines would not walk away from. The show stops being a family sitcom and becomes something else entirely. Something more chaotic, more surreal, more detached from the kind of reality that the early seasons were careful to maintain a connection with. The internet has been debating when The Simpsons declined in quality for roughly 20 years. Fans and critics have proposed various turning points. Different episodes get blamed. Different seasons get named as the moment the show lost its way. The coma theory says the answer is precise. The Simpsons did not decline. Homer's brain got worse. And here's the detail that makes this theory burrow into you and refuse to leave. 6 months before the coma episode in the season 4 premiere entitled Homer the Heretic, Homer has a conversation with God. an actual, direct, face-to-face conversation. And during that conversation, God tells Homer something specific. He tells Homer that he will learn the meaning of life, but not yet. He says Homer's time is coming. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. The timeline is exact. God, in a canonical episode of the show, told Homer that his time was nearly up, and 6 months after that conversation, Homer's conscious life ended. What the show presents as a quirky, theological, comedic beat reads, under the coma theory, as a prophecy. A warning delivered in the language of sitcom theology that carried a completely literal meaning. Homer's time was coming, and it came. And everything that followed was the dream of a man whose waking life had quietly ended on a Tuesday in April. Now let's look at what the coma theory explains, because its explanatory power is remarkable. The aging problem first. Nobody in The Simpsons ages. Bart has been 10 years old for 36 years. Lisa has been 8. Maggie has been 1. Homer and Marge have not accumulated a single additional wrinkle. The show uses what's called a floating timeline, where the present is always the present, the characters are always the same age, and the past reshapes itself around them as needed. Every theory about the show has to find a way to address this impossibility. The radiation theory proposes that cellular mutation has prevented normal biological aging. Cartoon logic says it's just how animated shows work. The coma theory has the simplest and simultaneously the most devastating answer of all. Nobody ages because they exist inside the mind of a man who went to sleep in April 1993 and never woke up. Of course, his children don't age. His unconscious brain cannot imagine them growing up because he wasn't there to see it happen. His wife doesn't age because the last time he saw her before the vending machine fell, she looked exactly like that. His neighbors don't change because his memory of them is frozen at the moment the candy bar disappeared into the machine. Homer's coma dream preserves his world exactly as it was on the day he lost it, because that is what the unconscious mind does. It locks you in place. It holds the last moment of waking experience perfectly still, like a photograph that replaces the living world it depicts. The celebrity appearances that flood the later seasons of the show also make complete and elegant sense under the coma theory. Homer is lying in a hospital bed. The television in his room is on. Conversations happen around him. The radio plays. People come and go from his bedside. His unconscious mind, desperate to maintain the simulation of the life he's lost, absorbs fragments of the external world. It hears voices, names, cultural references, music, and it incorporates them into the dream. And every celebrity who appears in Springfield is, in this reading, a voice Homer heard through the fog of unconsciousness, translated into a dream character by a brain trying to keep the world populated with familiar and semi-familiar presences. The later seasons aren't flooded with celebrity guests because Springfield became a magnet for famous people. They're flooded because Homer's brain is absorbing more and more of the external world as the dream deepens and the mental architecture requires more material to sustain itself. The surreal escalation of the plots also fits this framework perfectly. As a coma progresses, as the brain loses function, as the dream deepens, the logic that governed the early episodes begins to fray. The internal coherence that made the early Simpsons feel grounded gives way to something looser, stranger, more disconnected from cause and effect. This is not bad writing. This is neurological decay depicted in real time as narrative. The show becomes more surreal because Homer's brain becomes less capable of maintaining a coherent simulation. The dream gets weirder because the dreamer is getting worse. The show itself has engaged with this theory directly, which is perhaps the most remarkable piece of evidence for how seriously the people who make it take the idea. In season 34, an episode included a deliberately leaked fake deleted scene in which Homer wakes from a long coma and reveals that every outlandish episode since season 4 was just a dream. The show's writers animated this scene, voiced it, constructed it with care, and then packaged it as a hoax claiming it was planted by hackers. But think about what this means. The writers did not simply dismiss the theory. They engaged with it. They built a scene responding to it. They showed the audience exactly what confirmation of the theory would look like. And then they told the audience it was a joke. They showed you the truth and told you it was a lie, wrapped the whole thing in enough irony and plausible deniability that the audience laughed and moved on. Executive producer Al Jean addressed the theory directly in 2015. He said it wasn't true. He dismissed it as fan speculation. But Al Jean did not explain why nobody ages. He did not explain the dramatic tonal shift after season 4. He did not explain why God told Homer his time was coming 6 months before the coma. He did not explain why the show has become progressively more surreal and detached from reality across its run, following exactly the pattern you would expect from a dream generated by a brain in progressive decline. He said it was not true. The interviewer moved on. The fans did not move on, because the theory does something that no official explanation has managed to do. It makes the whole show make sense. All of it. The aging freeze and the tonal shift and the celebrity flood and the increasingly impossible plots and the reset button that wipes consequences between episodes, and the fact that Homer can survive anything and recover from everything. Because in the coma theory, nothing is actually happening to Homer's body. His body is in a hospital bed. Only his mind is in Springfield. And his mind cannot kill him because his mind is the one telling the story. There is a moment in the coma theory reading that stays with you long after you've finished thinking through the evidence. If the theory is true, then the emotional core of the show is not comedy. It is not satire. It is not social commentary, though it contains all of those things. The emotional core of The Simpsons, if the coma theory is correct, is grief. Homer's deepest and most desperate wish is almost impossibly simple. He wants his family. That is all. He wants Marge to still love him. He wants Bart to still be his mischievous little boy. He wants Lisa to still play her saxophone badly in her room. He wants Maggie to still be small enough to hold in the crook of one arm. He wants the noise and the chaos and the discomfort and the love of a house on Evergreen Terrace to keep going forever. And in the coma, it does. The dream gives him everything he wants. His family preserved in amber, his children who never grow up, his wife who never leaves, his life that never ends. Homer's coma is not a nightmare. It is the only version of paradise that a man like Homer Simpson would ever think to ask for. A house where the kids are always young and the beer is always cold and nobody ever has to say goodbye. Every time Homer survives something impossible, every time the world resets to normal, every time the credits roll and everything goes back to the way it was. It is not lazy writing. It is the dream refusing to end. It is an unconscious man's mind using the last of its resources to hold onto the only thing it ever really cared about. It is a father who cannot let go. And that interpretation of the show, that reading of 36 seasons of jokes and adventures and couch gags, transforms every episode from a comedy into something much quieter and much sadder and, in its own way, much more profound. Homer Simpson has been dreaming since April 1993. And every episode you have ever watched since then is a love letter from an unconscious father to the family he cannot reach. Section 3. Who really shot Mr. Burns? The summer of 1995 was a cultural moment. It's worth understanding the scale of what The Simpsons attempted that year because it was genuinely unprecedented for an animated television show. The series pulled off something that had never been tried in the medium before. A genuine mystery. A real whodunit. An honest-to-goodness cliffhanger designed and promoted with the specific intention of getting the entire American viewing public to play detective for the better part of an entire summer. The Season 6 finale, Who Shot Mr. Burns Part 1, aired in May 1995. Fox promoted it like a national event. America's Most Wanted, a long-running true crime program, produced a tie-in special called Springfield's Most Wanted that treated the fictional shooting as a real unsolved case. The show's creators invited viewers to submit their guesses for the shooter, with the promise that the winner would be animated into an actual future episode. It was a puzzle designed to be solved. A mystery with clues embedded in the episode, red herrings carefully constructed, suspects given elaborate and plausible motives, and an answer that the writers insisted could be deduced from the available evidence. And the answer, when it came in September 1995 with Part 2, was Maggie Simpson. Baby Maggie, the 1-year-old. She found Burns' gun on the ground, it went off, And the richest man in Springfield spent several episodes recovering in a hospital bed from a bullet wound inflicted by an infant. The show committed to this answer. The writers stand behind it. The DVD commentaries treat it as settled and final. Maggie did it, except the case was never really closed. And the more carefully you look at the evidence, the more the official answer starts to unravel. Let's go back to part 1 and establish exactly what we know. Mr. Burns has, by the end of the episode, given every single person in Springfield a reason to want him dead. He stole an oil well from beneath Springfield Elementary School, destroying the school's budget. He shut down Moe's Tavern by bankrupting its owner. He destroyed the Springfield Retirement Castle by creating a sinkhole. He injured Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog. And for his grand finale, he constructed a giant mechanical device that blocked out the sun over the entire town, forcing Springfield into perpetual darkness so that every resident would have no choice but to buy their electricity from his plant. This last move is worth pausing on because it is genuinely extraordinary in its scope and its cruelty. Burns did not just inconvenience the town, he stole the sky from them. He took the most fundamental natural resource available to every living thing on Earth, sunlight itself, and monetized it. He turned the act of existing in the world into a financial transaction with his plant as the only available service provider. When his longtime assistant Smithers protested this final act, Burns fired him on the spot, eliminating the last internal check on his behavior. By the time the town gathered at a public meeting to confront Burns, every person in Springfield had been personally wronged by the man. Homer, who had endured years of Burns being unable to remember his name despite Homer working directly for him, was visibly at a breaking point. The school's staff and students were furious about the oil well. The retirement community was homeless. Moe had lost his livelihood. Groundskeeper Willie had lost his job. Even Smithers, freshly fired after years of devoted service, was spiraling. Multiple characters were shown arriving at the meeting armed. The tension was thick enough to touch. Then Burns was shot. He staggered to the town sundial and fell, his hands landing on 2 specific letters. The ambulance took him away. The screen went black. America had to wait. Now let's talk about the contest, because this is the first place the official narrative starts to show cracks. Fox invited viewers across America to submit their guesses. Thousands upon thousands of entries were received. And according to the DVD commentary for the episodes, in a revelation that the show's own creators made and then apparently hoped nobody would think too hard about, not a single person from the randomly selected sample of contest entries guessed at the correct answer. Not one. The person who was awarded the prize was chosen randomly from the sample pool, and because they hadn't actually gotten the answer right, they received a cash payment instead of being animated into an episode. The grand prize, the incentive that was supposed to demonstrate the contest's legitimacy, was quietly converted to money because there was no winner. The writers acknowledged on the commentary that they were aware of exactly one person who had posted the correct answer online on the night of the original broadcast. One person on a Simpsons news group who had figured it out. But this person was using a college internet account, and by the time the contest ended and the producers tried to find them, the account was inactive. They could not locate the one person who got it right. They issued an open invitation on the DVD release for this person to come forward. As far as anyone knows, they never did. Think about what this means. The show's creators designed a mystery. They told the public it was solvable from the evidence presented in Part 1. They ran a national contest around it. And when the answer was revealed, essentially nobody had figured it out. Either the clues were insufficient, the red herrings were too effective, or the answer did not logically follow from the evidence in the way the show claimed it did. The contest was the show's promise that the mystery was fair, that a careful viewer could solve it. The contest's failure is evidence that the promise was not kept. Now let's look at the actual evidence and see what it actually points to. Burns falls on the sundial. His hands land on the letters W and S, or from his own perspective, M and S. The official reading is that Burns deliberately positioned himself to indicate his attacker's initials. M for Maggie, S for Simpson. But here's the problem. Burns himself stated on the record in the episode that the positioning of his hands on those letters was not intentional. He did not deliberately fall in a way that would point to his attacker. He simply fell. The sundial clue, the central piece of physical evidence that the show uses to justify its conclusion, was explicitly described by the victim himself as a coincidence. The most dramatic clue in the mystery is, by the account of the only person who would know, meaningless. Then there is the gun. Burns carried a gun in a holster. Before the shooting, the holster is shown empty. The gun was already missing from his person prior to the attack. Whoever shot Burns used Burns' own weapon. This is a significant constraint. It means the shooter was not someone who brought a weapon to the town meeting. Most of the suspects at the meeting had weapons. They brought them specifically because they were angry enough at Burns to contemplate violence. But Burns' shooter was different. The shooter was someone who was not armed, who had not planned to shoot anyone, who came across Burns' gun by chance and used it in a moment of impulse or accident. A baby finding a gun on the ground fits this profile. So does a considerable number of other characters who were not carrying weapons that evening. The profile does not uniquely identify Maggie. Then there are Burns' last words before the shooting. The show depicts Burns, in the moment before the gun fires, saying something. He recognizes his attacker. He says calmly, without fear, without surprise, "Oh, it's you, not alarm, not terror, not the reaction of a man who suddenly finds himself in danger." The composed, almost warm recognition of encountering someone familiar. Someone he knows. Someone he does not consider a threat. That is the specific register of, "Oh, it's you," as delivered in that moment. Now ask yourself, does Mr. Burns recognize Maggie Simpson? Has he ever had a meaningful interaction with her? Does the show establish any relationship between Burns and the Simpson infant prior to this episode? The answer is no. Burns barely recognizes Homer, his own employee of many years. The idea that Burns would see a baby he has no established relationship with and respond with the specific calm familiarity of, "Oh, it's you," does not track with either Burns' character or the show's established continuity. "Oh, it's you" is the greeting of someone who knows the person they are encountering, someone whose presence makes sense in this specific context. Someone Burns would encounter in a parking lot at night and feel no alarm about seeing. Now, in season 18 of the show, years after the mystery was supposedly resolved, Homer makes a casual remark. He claims, almost as a throwaway comment, that he was actually the one who shot Mr. Burns. He says this on camera, and nobody reacts. Nobody investigates. Nobody calls the police. Nobody reopens the case. Homer confesses to the attempted murder of the wealthiest man in Springfield, and the show treats it like he said something mildly amusing and moved on. Either Homer is lying for attention, which is absolutely consistent with his character and therefore cannot be dismissed, or the original verdict was wrong and Homer knows it because Homer pulled the trigger. And if Homer did it, then Maggie was framed. A baby was identified as the perpetrator of a crime committed by her father. The evidence that supposedly proved Maggie's guilt, the DNA analysis that pointed to a Simpson, the sundial that Burns himself said was coincidence, the testimony of a man who had just woken from a coma with a bullet wound and could not be considered a fully reliable witness, was either manufactured, misinterpreted, or both. The Marge theory deserves careful attention here because it is surprisingly strong. A Reddit-based analysis argues that Marge Simpson is the most logical candidate for the real shooter. Let's think through it. Marge watched Burns destroy her children's school, taking away the resources that her daughter depended on for her education. She watched Burns injure the family dog. She watched Burns block out the sun over the town where her children were growing up, consigning them to a life of artificial darkness so that one man could extract more money from their daily existence. Marge, who is consistently depicted as the emotional anchor of her family and the person most attuned to threats to her children's well-being, had a powerful and personal motive. She was also not visibly armed at the town meeting. She fits the profile of someone who encountered Burns's gun by chance, rather than arriving prepared to use one. And then there's this. Burns fell in love with Marge. The episode Marge Gets a Job depicts Burns developing a genuine infatuation with Marge Simpson. He found her attractive. He pursued her. He remembered her in a way that he notably fails to remember Homer, his own employee. The theory argues that this explains why Burns, upon waking from his coma, did not identify Marge as his attacker. He protected her. He took the bullet, recovered, and rather than name the woman he had been infatuated with, he directed attention elsewhere. He looked at the sundial and let the town draw its own conclusions. A man who loved Marge, even in the complicated and problematic way that Burns experienced anything resembling love, might choose to absorb the consequence rather than send her to prison. Maggie was the perfect solution to this problem, and the show knows it. Chief Wiggum says it himself with complete explicitness. No jury in the world would convict a baby. Possibly Texas, he concedes, but nowhere reasonable. Maggie was the ideal fall guy for a system that needed to close a case. An infant too young to deny the accusation, too young to understand what she was being accused of, too young to ever face any consequence, too young to ever tell a different story. The alternate endings are perhaps the most telling piece of evidence about the show's own uncertainty regarding its answer. A complete alternate conclusion was fully animated, fully voiced, fully produced, in which Smithers is revealed as the shooter. This ending was not a quick sketch or a rough cut. It was a finished piece of work. It was eventually shown during a clip show episode where the host, Troy McClure, dismisses it by pointing out that accepting it would require ignoring the DNA evidence pointing to a Simpson, which McClure describes as downright nutty. That line is itself a reference to the O.J. Simpson trial, in which a jury famously chose to discount DNA evidence. The show is winking at the audience. It is telling you, explicitly, that ignoring DNA evidence is something that happens, that official verdicts and physical evidence do not always align, that the machinery of justice produces results that serve the needs of the system, rather than the requirements of the truth. An early draft of the script had Barney Gumble as the shooter. The writers considered this seriously and planned to send him to prison. They abandoned it, but the existence of this option confirms that the answer was not predetermined by the clues. The clues were adjusted to fit whatever answer the writers eventually landed on. The mystery was reverse engineered. The evidence was tailored to support a conclusion that was chosen after the fact, which means the evidence does not have the kind of exclusive pointing power that a fair mystery requires. The final image of Part 2 is worth returning to. After the case is closed, after Burns has identified Maggie and been dismissed as a credible threat, after the episode has reached its official resolution, the camera lingers on a moment. Everyone else has left the room. Maggie is alone. She looks around carefully with a deliberateness that is notable for an infant, and checks that nobody is watching. Then she moves her pacifier in a gesture that mimics pulling a trigger. The official reading of this moment is straightforward. It's confirmation. Maggie knows what she did. She remembers it. She's reenacting it in private. Case closed. But consider the alternative reading. Maggie is not reenacting something she did. She is reenacting something she saw. She watched someone shoot Mr. Burns. She watched the act in close proximity as an infant present in that parking lot. And she is doing what babies do. She is mimicking what she observed. She is not confessing. She is remembering. The gesture is a witness's account, not a perpetrator's. Who really shot Mr. Burns? The official answer is Maggie Simpson. The show committed to it, and the writers stand behind it. But the contest that nobody won, the clues that the victim himself described as coincidental, the fully animated alternate endings, the season 18 confession that the show treated as throwaway dialogue, and the final shot of a baby reenacting something she witnessed all point toward a different conclusion. The greatest mystery in the history of The Simpsons was never actually solved. It was closed. And in Springfield, those two things are very different. Section 4. The immortality of Mr. Burns. Charles Montgomery Burns should be dead. This is not a metaphorical observation. It is not commentary on his moral character or his business practices, though those would certainly warrant it. It is a straightforward biological statement. By any reasonable interpretation of the show's own continuity, by any reading of the evidence the show has provided about his age, his physical condition, and the various medical crises he has survived, Charles Montgomery Burns should not be alive. And yet he is. He has been for a very long time. The question of how old Mr. Burns actually is has occupied Simpsons fans and scholars for decades, and the show itself has been delightfully, maddeningly inconsistent online about answering it. His age has been stated, implied, and then contradicted multiple times across multiple seasons. But the disease equilibrium that the show depicts in one of its most famous medical scenes adds another layer to this picture. A doctor examining Burns informs him that he has every disease known to medical science. All of them, simultaneously. The doctor explains that these diseases exist in a state of perfect equilibrium within Burns's body. Each one cancels out the others. They are all present, all active, all theoretically lethal, but because they are all present at once, they create a biological gridlock. Three Stooges syndrome, the doctor calls it, comparing it to three people trying to get through a doorway at the same moment. None of them can pass through. The doctor concludes that Burns is, technically, the sickest man in the United States, but functionally indestructible because every single thing that should kill him is being blocked by every other single thing that should kill him. This is played as one of the show's great comedic moments. It is immediately and intuitively funny. And under normal circumstances, that is all it is. But consider it in light of the weekly radiation treatments. Burns's body is not maintaining this disease equilibrium through any natural biological process. The treatments are maintaining it. The controlled radiation exposure that keeps Burns alive is simultaneously keeping his diseases in perfect stasis, balanced against each other, preventing any single condition from gaining dominance. The treatments are not curing his diseases. They are managing them, holding them in a precise arrangement, like a master juggler, keeping dozens of objects in the air at once, ensuring that the moment of systemic failure never arrives because the radiation is always there to redistribute the load. Burns's body is a reactor. His weekly treatments are the equivalent of adjusting the control rods in a nuclear core to prevent a meltdown. The precision required is extraordinary. The expertise required to administer these treatments correctly, to hit exactly the right radiation dose to maintain the balance without tipping it, is not something that can be delegated to just anyone. Which brings us to Smithers. Waylon Smithers is Burns's devoted assistant. The show has explored their relationship from many angles across many seasons, and the most commonly discussed dimension of it is Smithers's unrequited love for his employer. That element is real and consistent, and the show handles it with more sensitivity than you might expect. But there is another dimension to their relationship that is less discussed and arguably more important. Smithers manages Burns's schedule. All of it. He ensures that Burns makes every weekly appointment. He monitors Burns's physical condition with a vigilance that borders on obsession, even by the standards of the most dedicated assistant imaginable. He is the logistical infrastructure that keeps Burns's life functioning. And the show has established repeatedly that if Smithers were ever removed from the picture, Burns would be helpless. Not emotionally helpless, not professionally helpless, physically helpless. Without Smithers managing the treatment schedule, Burns would miss a dose. The disease equilibrium would collapse. Every illness in his body would surge forward simultaneously, and the result would be immediate and total. Smithers is not devoted to Burns purely out of love, complex and real as that love appears to be. He is devoted because he understands, on a level that possibly nobody else in Springfield does, that his absence is a death sentence. Smithers knows how Burns stays alive. Smithers knows what happens without him. And that knowledge creates a bond that goes deeper than affection. It is the bond of necessity. Smithers is keeping Burns alive through logistical competence, and they both know it. Burns's connection to historical events opens further questions about the scope of what he has managed to achieve. The show has depicted Burns referencing or participating in an extraordinary range of historical moments. He served in World War II in a capacity that he does not discuss in detail, suggesting it was not a capacity he would be proud of. He stole from the United States government during wartime and evaded the consequences for decades. He attended Yale. He knew figures from the early 20th century as personal acquaintances. He has described the Gilded Age not as a historical period, but as the time when his family was doing things that one does when the world is arranged in a certain particular way. And the Burns family itself is a fascinating and underexplored element of the story. The show has established that the Burns dynasty extends back centuries, not decades. Centuries. They were the kind of wealthy that predates the Industrial Revolution, the kind of wealthy that built infrastructure and then charged everyone else to use it. The kind of wealthy that exists so far above accountability that the concept of legal consequence becomes theoretical rather than practical. Charles Montgomery Burns inherited this legacy and has been extending it for well over a century. The question the show never asks is whether Burns is unique, whether his impossible longevity is a personal achievement or a family tradition. If the Burns dynasty has maintained continuous control of its fortune for centuries, and if the current Burns has been artificially extending his lifespan through nuclear medicine, is it possible that previous Burns patriarchs employed earlier versions of the same basic strategy? Before nuclear radiation, before the specific treatment regimen that currently maintains Burns, did the family have other methods, other interventions, other ways of holding on to power past the point where biology would normally require a transfer of authority? The show does not answer this, but it does establish that the Burns family has been in continuous control of its resources for longer than most American institutions have existed. That kind of continuity does not happen through natural generational succession alone. It requires either extraordinary luck sustained across centuries, which strains credulity, or extraordinary measures. Burns has come closer to dying than almost any other character in the show's run. He has been shot. He has been hospitalized dozens of times. He has collapsed, fallen, been attacked in various ways, been abandoned in the wilderness with no resources. And every single time he comes back, not through the cartoon resilience that Homer displays. Homer endures damage and heals through a combination of absurd physical toughness and narrative necessity. Burns recovers through infrastructure, through money, through the medical apparatus that his wealth has assembled specifically for the purpose of ensuring his continued existence, regardless of what his body goes through. Homer's immortality is passive. His body simply survives things it should not survive, and the show never provides a mechanism. Burns's immortality is engineered. It is the product of decades of deliberate investment, of resources directed toward a single purpose, of a system designed from the ground up with one goal in mind. Keep Burns alive. Every dollar spent, every institution corrupted, every politician purchased, every doctor retained, every facility built or controlled or pressured into compliance. All of it, at some level, serves the same ultimate function. Ensure the treatments continue. Maintain the disease equilibrium. Keep the reactor running. Because if Burns dies, everything he has built, everything he has controlled, everything that has kept Springfield in its current configuration, ends. And empires, Burns would certainly agree, do not allow themselves to end. The most unsettling aspect of the Burns immortality theory is not the possibility that he might live forever. It is the recognition that Springfield has, in a very practical sense, constructed its own situation to require him. The town's economy runs on the power plant. The power plant runs on Burns. Burns runs on the treatments. The treatments depend on the infrastructure of wealth that Burns controls. It is a closed loop, a system that feeds itself, where the man, the machine, and the money circulate endlessly without any point at which the cycle can be interrupted. Springfield cannot kill Burns because Springfield cannot survive without Burns. And Burns cannot die because dying would mean that the system he has spent over a century constructing would finally have to answer for what it has done to the people living inside it. He is not immortal. He is something more specific than immortal. He is too expensive to die. And Springfield will keep paying the bill for as long as Burns keeps the lights on, which, if his treatment schedule holds, will be forever. Section 5. The Principal and the Pauper. Springfield's Machinery of Denial. In September 1997, The Simpsons aired an episode that broke something. Not the show's quality, though fans would argue about that. Not its ratings, though those were beginning their long decline. It broke something more fundamental. It broke the audience's trust in the show's commitment to its own continuity. And for almost 30 years since, that episode has been cited as evidence of the show losing its way. The moment the writers stopped caring. The moment The Simpsons betrayed the people who loved it. But there is another way to read this episode, and it is a more interesting way, and it is the reading that turns this much maligned hour of television into the single most important episode the show has ever produced. The episode is called The Principal and the Pauper, and it did not break The Simpsons. It diagnosed Springfield. Let's go through what happens slowly because every beat of this episode matters. Springfield Elementary is holding a celebration honoring Principal Seymour Skinner's 20 years of service to the school. The ceremony is proceeding normally when a stranger arrives. A man nobody recognizes. He introduces himself by name. He says his name is Sergeant Seymour Skinner. He is, he explains, a decorated Vietnam War veteran who was captured as a prisoner of war, held in Southeast Asia, presumed dead. He survived. He escaped. He came home. And he came home to find that someone else had been living his life. The man Springfield has known as Principal Seymour Skinner for 20 years is not Seymour Skinner. His real name is Armin Tamzarian. Before the Vietnam War, Tamzarian was a street criminal, a petty offender, a young man from the wrong side of the tracks with no future, no prospects, no family that wanted him, no identity worth keeping. He was drafted. He served in the same unit as the real Seymour Skinner. When Skinner was captured and presumed killed, Tamzarian was overwhelmed by guilt. He traveled to Springfield to find Skinner's mother, Agnes, and deliver the news of her son's death. But when Tamzarian arrived, Agnes looked at him and assumed he was her son. She needed him to be her son. She was a woman facing the loss of the only person who anchored her to the world, and this young man from her son's unit was standing in her door. And Tamzarian, who had never been wanted by anyone, who had never had a family or a home or a name that meant anything to anyone, made a choice. He did not correct her. He stepped into the life that was being offered to him. He became Seymour Skinner. He took the name, the rank, the relationship, the history, and he lived inside that borrowed identity for 20 years. Until the real Seymour Skinner walked through the gymnasium door. Now here is where the episode becomes extraordinary. The truth is fully exposed. Every person in Springfield now knows that their principal is an imposter, that the man who has run their school, who has disciplined their children, who has argued with their teachers and attended their parent-teacher conferences and shaped the educational lives of an entire generation of Springfield residents, is not who he says he is. The fraud is complete. The evidence is standing in the room, wearing his own face. Springfield holds a meeting, and the meeting is not about what to do with the imposter. It is not about how to restore the real Skinner's identity. It is not about justice or accountability or the simple, factual question of which man's name is which. The meeting is about whether to acknowledge the truth at all. And the verdict, reached by the community of Springfield in full possession of the relevant facts, is unanimous. They vote to keep the lie. Judge Snyder issues a legal decree that Armin Tamzarian is henceforth the real Seymour Skinner. The actual Seymour Skinner, the veteran who survived a prisoner of war camp and crossed the world to reclaim his identity, is tied to a railroad car and physically expelled from Springfield. And the decree includes a specific provision. It is illegal to mention the truth again, ever, under penalty of torture. Let that settle. A community in full possession of irrefutable evidence that a central public figure has been living under a stolen identity for 2 decades, with the actual owner of that identity present and available to assume it, voted to keep the fraud. They voted to make the lie the law. They voted to exile the truth and criminalize memory. When the episode aired, the reaction from fans was immediate and sustained. Harry Shearer, who voices Skinner, publicly expressed his displeasure with the storyline. Critics argued that it destroyed Skinner's character by erasing the history that made him interesting. The episode has been ranked among the worst in the series. It is consistently cited as the moment The Simpsons stopped caring about its own continuity and started treating its characters as disposable. But here is what all of that criticism misses. every single thing the critics found objectionable about this episode is exactly what makes it the most honest episode the show has ever produced. Springfield has always operated this way. The town has always chosen comfortable lies over inconvenient truths. The town has always voted, collectively and tacitly, to forget whatever doesn't fit the story it wants to tell about itself. The only difference between this episode and every other episode is that this episode showed you the mechanism. It showed you the vote. It showed you the legal decree. It showed you the physical expulsion of the truth teller from the community. It made explicit what the show has always left implicit. Every other time Springfield forgets something catastrophic, every other time the town ignores a contradiction or resets to normal, after something irreversible happens, it happens off-screen, between episodes, in the unnarrated space between the credits of one story and the cold open of the next. The Principal and the Pauper is the one time the show let the audience watch the process in real time. And the process is disturbing. Consider how many times Springfield has experienced events that should permanently and irrevocably alter the town's reality. The town has been destroyed and rebuilt. It has been sealed under a glass dome by the federal government. It has survived nuclear near misses. It has experienced environmental catastrophes on a scale that would qualify as national emergencies. It has been subjected to alien encounters, attempted hostile takeovers, and the literal theft of the sun from its sky. And after every single one of these events, by the following episode, everything is back to normal. The catastrophe has not been processed. The trauma has not been integrated. The experience has simply not happened. The standard explanation for this is episodic television structure. Shows in this format do not carry consequences from one episode to the next, because the format does not require them to. The slate resets. The audience accepts this as a convention of the medium. But the Principal and the Pauper offers a different explanation. Springfield resets not because of episodic structure, but because the town collectively chooses to reset. Through an unspoken but operational social contract that says, we will not acknowledge what happened. We will maintain the agreed-upon version of reality. We will treat the fiction as fact and the fact as criminal, and anyone who breaks this contract will be removed from the community. This is not a cartoon convention. This is how real communities function. Small towns in particular have a capacity for collective denial that is well documented and occasionally terrifying. Scandals get buried. Crimes get forgotten. Uncomfortable histories get rewritten into official narratives until the rewrite is the only version anyone remembers. The machinery of collective denial is not a fictional invention. It is a real human phenomenon, and Springfield's version of it is merely more explicit, more formalized, more legally codified than most real-world examples. The Principal and the Pauper didn't betray the Simpsons. It documented something that was already there. Think about the connections. If the radiation theory is correct, and the residents of Springfield are cognitively impaired by decades of nuclear contamination, the collective denial makes biological sense. They forget because their brains are damaged. They reset because the damage prevents the formation of long-term contextual memory. The vote to keep the lie isn't just social compliance. It's neurological incapacity expressed as policy. If the coma theory is correct, the denial has a different but equally complete explanation. Homer's dreaming mind cannot integrate information that would force the dream to end. If Springfield were to genuinely reckon with the dome or the nuclear incidents or the identity fraud of its own principle, the internal logic of the dream would collapse under the weight of acknowledged reality. The dream maintains itself by refusing to process anything that would force it to confront its own nature. The vote to keep the lie is the dream protecting itself. And if neither of those more elaborate theories is operative, if Springfield is just a town of people living with the consequences of Burns's environmental catastrophe and the social structures that enable it, then the collective denial makes perfect strategic sense without any additional explanation. If they acknowledge the pollution, they would have to confront the plant. If they confronted the plant, they would have to challenge Burns. If they challenged Burns, the economy that sustains every business and every household in town would collapse. The lie is not comfortable. The lie is necessary. The lie is the structural foundation of the town's ability to function. So they vote for it every time. collectively, tacitly, automatically, and anyone who refuses to vote for it gets expelled. The real Seymour Skinner was Springfield's canary in the coal mine. He arrived with proof that the official narrative was a lie. He had documentation. He had his own face. He had the most irrefutable evidence possible that things were not what Springfield had agreed they were. And the town's response was not gratitude, not correction, not the honest and difficult work of integrating the truth into the community's understanding of itself. The town tied him to a train. That is the show's most honest statement about how Springfield maintains its impossible reality. Through consensus, through denial, through the systematic identification and elimination of anyone who threatens the agreed-upon version of events. The community does not need Burns to enforce this. It enforces it on itself. Every resident participates in the maintenance of the fiction, because every resident has something to lose if the fiction collapses. Armin Tamzarian is still pretending to be Seymour Skinner. Springfield is still pretending that it's fine. And the real Seymour Skinner is somewhere out there, tied to a train, exiled from his own life. The last honest man in a town that made honesty illegal. Section 6. Maggie Simpson, the silent genius. There is a member of the Simpson family who has never held a conversation, never delivered a monologue, never explained her motivations or her methods, never once sat down with another character and laid out what she was thinking in the clear and legible language that television drama depends upon. She is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. And in that time, without saying a word that anyone was intended to hear, without being the subject of a single episode that positioned her as the protagonist in any conventional sense, Maggie Simpson has accumulated a record of achievement that exceeds every other member of her family combined. She shot a man, not accidentally, not ambiguously, but with enough precision that the bullet found the richest and most powerful person in town and put him in a hospital bed. She led a rebellion in a daycare facility against an adult authority figure, coordinating other infants in a sustained campaign of resistance that succeeded in its objectives. She has saved her family from multiple life-threatening situations, often acting in moments when the adults around her were too panicked or too distracted to respond effectively. She has demonstrated problem-solving capabilities that would be remarkable in an adult, let alone in someone who cannot reliably walk from one side of a room to the other without falling. She has also, in one of the show's less discussed revelations, been tested and found to possess intelligence that does not fit on any standard scale designed for children of her developmental stage. And through all of it, she has said almost nothing. The story of Maggie Simpson is the story of the most intelligent person in Springfield choosing, deliberately and strategically, to be invisible. Let's start where the official narrative does with the shooting, because even accepting the show's answer at face value, the aftermath of the shooting tells you something important about who Maggie is. A 1-year-old was identified as the person who shot the most powerful man in town. The police investigated. The physical evidence was examined. Burns himself, upon recovering, confirmed the identification. And the legal conclusion, delivered with casual indifference by Chief Wiggum, was, "There is nothing to be done. No jury would convict a baby." And that was the end of it. But consider the final shot of that episode. The courtroom is emptied. Everyone has left. Maggie is alone. She looks around the room slowly, deliberately, with a quality of attention that is not the unfocused, random gaze of an infant. She checks her surroundings. She confirms that nobody is watching. And then, only when she has established her privacy, she moves her pacifier in a motion that specifically and unmistakably mimics pulling a trigger. The official reading, as we discussed in the Burns section, is confirmation. Maggie remembers what she did. She knows it had significance. She is reenacting it in private. Case closed, Baby confirmed. But look at the sequence of actions independent of the conclusion you're trying to support. She looked around to make sure nobody was watching. She waited until she had confirmed her privacy. Then she performed the action. That is not the behavior of an infant acting on impulse or from muscle memory. That is the behavior of someone who understands that certain actions have consequences when performed in front of others, and who has made a deliberate calculation to perform this particular action only when unobserved. That requires situational awareness. It requires memory, specifically the memory of observing something significant. It requires the ability to anticipate other people's reactions to her behavior. It requires impulse control, the ability to wait for the right moment, rather than acting immediately. These are not traits associated with one-year-olds. These are traits associated with someone who processes the world in a fundamentally different way than her developmental stage would suggest is possible. Now let's look at The Longest Daycare. This is a theatrical short film released in 2012. It runs 7 minutes. It was nominated for an Academy Award. And it is perhaps the most explicit and sustained demonstration of Maggie's cognitive capabilities that the show has ever produced. The premise is simple. Maggie is dropped at a daycare facility administered with clinical efficiency. Inside, she encounters a caterpillar she wants to protect. Another infant, designated as the facility's bully, wants to destroy it. What follows is Maggie defeating a hostile environment, an adult authority structure, and an active physical threat using nothing but the resources available to her, doing it in silence and doing it successfully. Watch what she actually does. She assesses the environment before she acts. She identifies the hierarchy, understanding who has authority, who monitors what, where the gaps in supervision are. She develops a strategy. She executes it in stages, adjusting when things don't go as planned, improvising when the original approach fails, finding alternative paths when the direct route is blocked. She predicts the behavior of the adults around her. She anticipates the bully's actions. She times her movements to avoid observation. And she succeeds. The caterpillar becomes a butterfly and is released. Maggie accomplished all of this using the motor skills of a 1-year-old. She falls. She stumbles. She cannot reliably walk from point A to point B without a digression to the floor. Her body is a genuine limitation on her effectiveness. But her decision-making is flawless. Every choice she makes is the correct choice. Every problem she encounters, she solves. Her intelligence compensates completely for every physical constraint her developmental stage imposes. She is operating cognitively at a level that her body cannot support. And she succeeds anyway. The show has tested Maggie's intelligence directly across various episodes using different instruments and different contexts. The results vary somewhat depending on the episode and the requirements of the story, but the pattern is unmistakable and consistent. Maggie's intelligence registers as extraordinary, off the charts, beyond what the available tools can measure meaningfully. The show deploys this as a quick joke and moves on, but the joke has been made enough times, across enough seasons, in enough different contexts, that it is not a joke anymore. It is characterization. Maggie is genuinely and measurably and profoundly intelligent. The show tells you this repeatedly, and then it shows you a baby who still sucks on a pacifier and cannot walk down a hallway without falling over. The gap between what Maggie demonstrably is and what Maggie presents as is the central mystery of her character. And the most elegant explanation for that gap is the one that is also the most unsettling. Maggie is silent because she has decided to be silent. Consider what it would mean for Maggie to reveal herself. Consider what has happened to the other intelligent person in this family, the one who made the opposite choice. Lisa Simpson is brilliant. She is a genuine intellectual, a child with an IQ that dwarfs everyone in her household and most of the adults in Springfield. She has been awarded the second highest intelligence rating in Springfield's recorded history. She is a musician, a scholar, an activist, a person of genuine moral seriousness in a town where moral seriousness is punished. And what has that intelligence gotten her? Isolation. The particular loneliness of being the person in the room who understands what everyone else is missing. Mockery, because her seriousness reads as pomposity to people who are not capable of matching her. Dismissal, because authority figures, overwhelmed or threatened by her capabilities, default to condescension rather than engagement. Lisa speaks up and gets ignored. Lisa challenges the status quo and gets punished for the challenge. Lisa tries to improve the world around her, consistently, earnestly, with every resource she has, and the world around her consistently refuses to be improved. Lisa's intelligence is her greatest gift, and it is her curse. Because she deploys it visibly, she wears it on the outside. She announces herself as the smartest person in the room, and then watches the room decide that this is a problem to be managed rather than an asset to be used. Maggie watched this happen. From the earliest days of her conscious existence, from whatever point the extraordinary intelligence she possesses became operational, she has had a front row seat to the consequences of being smart in a family and a town that does not know what to do with smart people. She has watched her sister fight every single day for recognition and receive resistance in return. She has watched the most capable member of the family be consistently undervalued and dismissed by a community that rewards compliance and punishes insight. And Maggie chose the opposite strategy. Silence is power. Invisibility is armor. The less they notice you, the more you can accomplish. This is the lesson Maggie took from watching Lisa, and it is not a lesson a normal baby would be capable of drawing from observation. It is the conclusion of a sophisticated strategic mind watching a situation, analyzing it, identifying the pattern, and choosing a behavior that avoids the consequences while preserving the capability. Think about what Maggie has accomplished by maintaining her silence and her apparently helpless presentation. She shot a man and got away with it because nobody suspects a baby. She ran a daycare rebellion because nobody monitors infants closely enough to notice them organizing. Every significant thing she has done has been done in the margins, in the spaces where adult attention was not directed, using the cover of her apparent helplessness as operational camouflage. She is the most capable person in the Simpson family. She is almost certainly the most capable person in Springfield. And she has spent 36 years making absolutely certain that nobody figures this out. Now connect this to the larger frameworks we have been exploring. If the radiation theory is correct, if Burns's contaminated environment creates mutations that affect each person differently, then Maggie represents one extreme of a spectrum that Homer represents the other end of. Homer's mutation diminished his cognitive capabilities to a level that the show describes as clinical disability. Maggie's mutation amplified hers to levels that cannot be properly measured. Same environment, same family, same contaminated water and irradiated air. But where the father's brain was reduced, the daughter's was enhanced. Homer and Maggie are two sides of the same radioactive coin. If the coma theory is correct, Maggie's extraordinary capabilities represent something else entirely. If Homer is dreaming, if every episode is the product of an unconscious mind trying to maintain an illusion of the family it has lost, then Maggie's genius is Homer's deepest hope for the child he cannot see growing up. He cannot watch her develop. He cannot hear her first real words or see her first steps, or learn what kind of person she is becoming in real time. So in the dream, he makes her extraordinary. He gives her an intelligence that transcends her developmental stage. He makes her capable of things no actual baby could do. Because Homer needs to believe that Maggie will be okay without him. He needs to know that even in his absence, even as he lies unconscious in a hospital bed, the smallest and most vulnerable member of his family has resources he does not need to provide. The resources are already there, built into her from the beginning, present and reliable and more than equal to whatever the world brings. Maggie's genius, in this reading, is not a mutation. It is a prayer. An unconscious father's need to believe that his baby will be fine, that she was always going to be fine, that whatever happens, she was equipped for it. But Maggie's endgame, regardless of which framework you use to understand her, remains the show's last truly unsolved mystery. We know what she has done. We can observe what she is capable of. We can infer the strategy behind her silence. What we do not know is what she is waiting for. Because Maggie is clearly waiting for something. The intelligence is operational. The strategy is in place. The capabilities are beyond question. But the decisive action, the moment when all of that accumulated capability is deployed towards some ultimate purpose, has not come. 36 years of watching and processing and planning, and Maggie has not yet revealed what she has been building toward. Maybe she doesn't know yet. Maybe the plan requires more time, more information, more of the world to show its cards before the response becomes clear. Maybe Maggie is the kind of strategic intelligence that does not act until the moment is perfect, and the moment has not yet been perfect enough. Or maybe the show will never tell us. Maybe Maggie's endgame is the one secret Springfield keeps that is never revealed. Because the revelation would require giving her something the show has never given her, a voice. And the day Maggie decides to speak, to actually and deliberately use the language she is clearly capable of, will be the day the entire architecture of Springfield changes. Because if Maggie can speak, Maggie can ask questions. And the questions Maggie would ask, with 36 years of silent observation behind them, would be the questions Springfield has spent 36 years making it illegal to answer. Nobody will see it coming. That, more than anything else about her, is exactly how Maggie designed it. Section 7. The Simpsons predictions. Prophecy, pattern, or something stranger. Let's talk about the predictions. There is no element of the Simpsons phenomenon more visible in contemporary popular culture, more shared on social media, more discussed in casual conversation among people who have not watched the show in years than the predictions. The idea that a cartoon sitcom that debuted in 1989 has been accurately forecasting the events of the real world for over 3 decades. That the writers of an animated comedy about a yellow family in a fictional town have somehow been describing the future. The examples are genuinely remarkable when you line them up. In the year 2000, 25 years ago now, The Simpsons aired an episode called Bart to the Future. The episode depicts a future in which Lisa Simpson has become the first female president of the United States. And in that same episode, in a throwaway line establishing the political context for Lisa's situation, her predecessor in the Oval Office is identified as Donald Trump. The episode aired 16 years before Trump won the presidential election of 2016. 16 years. The show depicted a Trump presidency as a satirical absurdity, as the kind of thing that could happen in a future America that had fully surrendered to the logic of celebrity and spectacle, and then America went ahead and made it happen exactly as the joke had predicted. The internet's response was instantaneous and enormous. Screenshots from the episode circulated endlessly. The meme Trump was president and The Simpsons predicted it entered mainstream cultural consciousness and stayed there. People who had not thought about The Simpsons in years were suddenly asking the question, how did they know? The list continues. In a 1995 episode, Homer is shown using a device that resembles a modern smartwatch with near identical functionality. In a 1994 episode, Homer travels to space with Buzz Aldrin, decades before commercial space tourism became an operational industry. In a 1998 episode, Homer encounters a mathematical equation that appears to anticipate the mass of the Higgs boson particle, which would not be experimentally confirmed until 2012. In a 1999 episode, Homer proposes a theory suggesting the universe might be shaped like a donut. And in the years following, cosmological research identified radiation patterns that were interpreted by some scientists as suggesting the universe might have a toroidal shape. In a 1993 episode, a flu virus originating from Asia spreads to Springfield, causing mass panic, widespread hoarding, and a frantic institutional response searching for a cure. The episode aired 27 years before COVID-19. And in a detail that borders on the surreal, during the fictional outbreak in that episode, the panicking townspeople accidentally release a swarm of killer bees, which felt extraordinarily specific when Asian giant hornets, which American media quickly dubbed murder hornets, were reported in the United States during the actual pandemic of 2020. In 1996, the episode Homer Palookaville featured a joke in which the hip-hop group Cypress Hill accidentally books the London Symphony Orchestra while under certain chemical influences. That exact collaboration actually happened in 2024, when Cypress Hill performed alongside the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall. The gap between the joke and the reality was 28 years. In a 1998 episode, the show depicted the corporate entity then known as 20th Century Fox being acquired by a larger media conglomerate. The depicted acquirer was not specific, but the scenario of Fox being absorbed was presented as inevitable, almost matter of fact. Disney acquired 20th Century Fox in 2019. The list continues. Video calling technology. Autocorrect failures that generate unintended absurd messages. Mass surveillance culture. Various political scandals that mirror events the show depicted years earlier. Each new coincidence generates a new wave of sharing and discussion in the same question. How are they doing this? The people who actually make the show have an answer. Al Jean, executive producer and showrunner across much of the series' run, has addressed the prediction phenomenon directly and repeatedly. His answer is blunt and somewhat deflating. He says, "If you throw enough darts, you're going to hit some bullseyes." That's it. The Simpsons has produced nearly 800 episodes across 36 years. Each episode contains dozens of jokes, references, and satirical observations about American culture. When you generate that volume of content over that length of time, statistical probability ensures that some of it will align with future events. Not because of prescience, because of mathematics. Producer Bill Oakley, who ran the show during several of its most celebrated seasons, offered an even more specific explanation. He pointed out that most of the apparent predictions are based on trends that were already visible when the episodes were written. The writers did not predict a Trump presidency out of nowhere. They observed that Trump had been publicly and semi-seriously entertaining the idea of running for office since at least the late 1980s, that his name and his particular brand of celebrity billionaire politics had been a fixture of American popular culture for years, and they extrapolated that trajectory to its logical and absurd extreme. They did not predict the Disney-Fox merger. They observed that media consolidation was an accelerating and apparently unstoppable trend, and wrote a satirical gag about where it was heading. This is the official explanation, and it deserves respect because it is largely correct. The Simpsons writing staff has historically been one of the most educated in the history of television. Multiple writers hold degrees from Harvard, Yale, and similar institutions. Many have backgrounds not just in comedy writing, but in mathematics, science, computer science, and political theory. These are not people pulling random guesses out of the air. They are highly intelligent, deeply informed observers of American culture and American trends, people who have spent their careers studying where things are going and then depicting the destination before the journey is complete. They are not prophets. They are analysts who happen to work in comedy. They read the present more carefully than most people do and then push it forward by a few steps. Fact-checking organizations that have examined the prediction claims systematically have generally supported this explanation. Many of the most famous predictions turn out, on close examination, to be less specific than they appear in viral sharing, or to rely on a trend that was already obvious at the time of writing, or to be examples of confirmation bias where we remember the hits and forget the misses. And the misses are real. The Simpsons has made thousands of satirical observations about the trajectory of American culture and technology and politics that did not come true. Jokes about jetpacks and moon colonies and technologies that never materialized. Satirical predictions about political outcomes that went the other way. Cultural commentary about shifts that didn't happen. Nobody screenshots those. Nobody builds a theory around them. Confirmation bias works in one direction, collecting the confirmations and quietly discarding the disconfirmations until the remaining sample looks like prophecy. This is the rational, evidence-based, intellectually satisfying explanation for the prediction phenomenon. And it is, in its broad outlines, correct. But there is a subset of the most famous predictions that the statistical and analytical explanation handles less cleanly. A group of coincidences that are so specific, so detailed, so precisely aligned with subsequent reality, that probability and trend extrapolation feel inadequate as complete explanations. The Trump prediction did not merely forecast that a celebrity might run for president. It specified Trump by name. 16 years before the election, and in some versions of the story, it depicted Trump descending an escalator in a moment that visually parallels the actual announcement he made in 2015. Not just the concept, the visual. The Cypress Hill prediction did not just imagine an unusual musical collaboration. It specified Cypress Hill, and the London Symphony Orchestra, and the combination of the two. 28 years before the actual event. The Higgs-boson equation has been analyzed by physicists who confirm that the equation on Homer's blackboard does in fact predict a mass in the range that was eventually experimentally confirmed. This was not a vague illusion. It was a specific calculation that turned out to be correct. These cases resist the straightforward statistical explanation. They are not trend extrapolation. They are specific. And their specificity is what makes them strange. This is where the more interesting theory emerges. Not the supernatural version, not the time travel conspiracy, but the cultural feedback loop hypothesis. The Simpsons does not predict the future. The Simpsons shapes it, not through magic, through cultural influence of an extraordinary magnitude. The Simpsons is one of the most widely watched, most deeply quotable, most pervasively referenced pieces of American media in the history of the medium. It has been running for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. Its observations have become part of how Americans understand their own culture. Its vocabulary has entered the language. When it depicts something, that depiction enters the cultural bloodstream. Millions of people see it. It becomes a reference point. It becomes the lens through which subsequent events are interpreted. When The Simpsons depicts a Trump presidency as a satirical impossibility, that image does not disappear. It circulates. It becomes part of what Americans mean when they think about the direction their country is heading. It makes the scenario legible in advance. It primes the cultural imagination. When the event it depicted eventually arrives, it does not feel like a shock. It feels like recognition. We have seen this before. The Simpsons already showed us this. The show does not predict the Disney-Fox merger. The show makes media consolidation feel inevitable by depicting it as satire. When the merger actually happens, the cultural response is not shock. It is a collective sense of course. The Simpsons already told us this would happen. The show's satirical imagination became the template through which the real event was processed. This is not prediction. This is the mechanism by which sufficiently influential art shapes the events it depicts. By making the scenario familiar before it happens, by embedding it in the cultural vocabulary, by giving people the conceptual tools to recognize and describe and ultimately accept the scenario when reality produces it, the art participates in the construction of the reality it claims only to observe. Springfield doesn't reflect America. America has become Springfield. The show held up a mirror for 36 years, and we stared into it so long that we began to resemble what we saw. The nuclear power plant run by a corrupt and immortal billionaire, a plant that poisons the town it provides for, an incompetent government that cannot find basic problems, a population too distracted and too comfortable to notice how systematically they are being exploited, an endless cycle of catastrophe and reset in which the same mistakes recur without apparent consequence, a collective amnesia that permits each new disaster to begin fresh without the weight of the previous one. Springfield is not a prediction of where America was heading. Springfield is a diagnosis of where America already was when the show began in 1989. The predictions didn't require prophecy. They required attention. And there is one final piece of this that makes the phenomenon genuinely strange, even for people who have fully accepted the rational explanation. The Simpsons has also been wrong. Thousands of times. Jokes that didn't come true, predictions that failed, satirical observations that the world declined to confirm. We don't remember those. We can't remember those, not easily, not in the same vivid way we remember the ones that landed. Confirmation bias is powerful, and the internet is its most efficient amplification system ever constructed. But try explaining that to yourself the next time a Simpsons clip from 1997 lines up with a headline from this week. Because the truth is, even knowing how the trick works, even fully understanding the statistical mechanics and the confirmation bias and the cultural feedback loop, it is still impressive to watch. 800 episodes, 36 years, thousands of satirical observations about the trajectory of American life, and enough bullseyes to make even the show's own creators pause sometimes and wonder if maybe, just maybe, they know something they shouldn't. Section 8. Mona Simpson and the Burns Conspiracy. 3 generations broken. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. That was the official story, the one that Abe Simpson had maintained since Homer was a small child. He showed Homer a grave. He told him his mother was gone. And Homer, who needed the explanation to be true because the alternative was too painful to consider, believed him. He grew up carrying the particular weight of a child who lost his mother young, and everything about who Homer became as an adult was shaped by that absence. His desperate need to be liked, his clinginess, his terror of abandonment, his compulsive willingness to endure degradation and humiliation from anyone rather than risk losing the connection he has. His inability to confront authority, his emotional fragility beneath the surface bluster. All of it, every trait that defines Homer Simpson as a character, is a coping mechanism. A series of adaptations built around a wound that was inflicted when he was too young to process it and has never fully healed. Homer's personality is grief wearing a costume. In Season 7, the show revealed that the grief was built on a lie. The episode is called Mother Simpson. It aired in November 1995 and is widely regarded as one of the greatest episodes The Simpsons has produced. Homer, attempting to get out of working on a Saturday by faking his own death, ends up at the Hall of Records correcting the error, and there he discovers something that changes everything. According to municipal records, his mother is alive. She did not die. The grave Abe showed him belonged to a poet named Walt Whitman. Abe had been pointing at a famous writer's headstone for decades, presenting it as evidence of his wife's death, and Homer had never thought to look at the name on the stone. Homer finds Mona at a cemetery. She doesn't recognize him immediately. She hasn't seen him since he was a very small boy. She has been looking at a grave for 2 days that she believes belongs to her son, having heard a news report about Homer's fake death. And when the recognition happens, when Homer and his mother understand who they are to each other, it is one of the most quietly devastating scenes the show has ever produced. A grown man and his mother, separated for 27 years, meeting beside a headstone that belongs to neither of them. And then Mona tells him the truth about why she left. She did not leave because she stopped loving him. She did not leave because she wanted a different life, or because Homer was difficult, or because anything was wrong in the way the abandoned child always secretly fears something was wrong. She left because staying would have put Homer and Abe in danger, because the man who would become Homer's employer, the man Homer would spend his entire adult life working for without ever understanding the connection, had destroyed her life and forced her underground. The story goes back to 1969. Mona Simpson was ordinary, a housewife, married to Abe, mother of a small boy named Homer. Living quietly in Springfield while the world outside was going through the social upheavals of the late 1960s, the civil rights movement, the anti-war protests, the counterculture that was fracturing American society into competing visions of what the country should become. And then something changed. The show depicts it with the particular comedic exaggeration it uses for historical sequences, but the emotional weight is real. Mona was radicalized. She joined a group of activists, and their target was specific and deliberate. They targeted a biological weapons laboratory owned by Charles Montgomery Burns. Let that sentence sit for a moment. Burns did not just own a nuclear power plant. Burns owned a germ warfare facility, a laboratory in Springfield dedicated to the development of biological weapons, in the same town where he would later build a nuclear reactor with 342 safety violations, in the town where Homer would grow up and go to school and eventually start a family. Burns was manufacturing weaponized pathogens in the middle of a residential community. Mona and her group broke into the lab. They deployed what the show describes as an antibiotic bomb, a device designed to destroy the biological agents stored in the facility. The raid worked. The agents were neutralized. During the confusion, they accidentally cured the asthma of the security guard, who happened to be a young Clancy Wiggum, who would go on to become Springfield's police chief. The destruction of Burns's weapons was accomplished, and then Mona made a mistake. As the group fled, she stopped to help someone who had been knocked down in the chaos. The person was Burns. She helped the man whose weapons she had just destroyed. She stopped. She looked at his face, and Burns looked back at hers. He identified her. He reported her to the FBI. And from that moment, Mona Simpson's life as she had known it was over. She could not go home. She could not contact her family. She could not hold her son or explain to him why she was disappearing. She kissed Homer while he was sleeping and slipped away into a life underground. A life spent moving, staying invisible, never staying in one place long enough for Burns to find her. For 27 years. Homer woke up and his mother was gone. Abe told him she was dead. And Homer spent the next 3 decades as the person the lie made him, desperate for approval, terrified of loss, constitutionally unable to confront the people who had the power to take things away from him. Burns didn't just take Mona's life away. He took Homer's. And the conspiracy deepens from there, because Burns did not simply report Mona to the FBI and move on. He pursued her actively for decades. He held a personal grudge against a woman who had destroyed something he had built. And when Mona finally returns to Springfield in the season 7 episode, Burns spots her almost immediately. Through a cab window across a street, he recognizes her despite the years. He calls the authorities. The FBI arrives at the Simpson house. Mona has to flee again. Homer has to say goodbye to his mother for the second time. This time knowing why. This time knowing who was responsible. And Homer works for Burns. Homer has worked for Burns his entire adult life. Every paycheck Homer has ever received has come from the man who drove his mother underground when Homer was a small child. The person responsible for the core wound around which every aspect of Homer's personality has been organized signs Homer's check every week. And Homer does not connect these facts. He does not confront Burns. He does not quit. He does not process the relationship between the man who destroyed his family and the man he continues to serve. He goes back to work. This is not played as a joke. It is played as tragedy. As the specific tragedy of a man who is not capable of making the cognitive connections that would allow him to understand his own situation. The radiation, the crayon, the decades of cognitive erosion from living inside Springfield's contaminated environment, these have not just reduced Homer's IQ. They have impaired his ability to trace the architecture of his own suffering back to its source. Homer can't figure out what happened to him because the damage that was done to him also damaged the tools he would need to figure it out. The conspiracy goes one level deeper still. The show reveals, in a later season, that the employment arrangement that has kept Homer at the plant, despite his extraordinary incompetence, was not accidental. Burns had committed an unspecified crime. Grandpa Simpson discovered evidence of it, and rather than face any consequence for what he had done, Burns offered Abe a deal. In exchange for Abe's silence, Burns would guarantee Homer a job at the plant no matter what. No matter how many mistakes, no matter how many violations, no matter how many times he should have been let go, Homer Simpson would always have a position at the Springfield nuclear power plant. 742 documented errors. And Homer was never permanently dismissed because a secret deal between his father and his mother's persecutor required his presence on the payroll. Homer's job security, the thing that has always seemed like a lazy narrative convenience, the thing that casual viewers chalk up to cartoon logic, is actually a contractual obligation. A transaction between Abe Simpson and the man who destroyed the Simpson family, conducted in secret, maintained across decades, never explained to the person it most directly affected. Homer's father struck a deal with the enemy to buy his son a position in the enemy's facility. And Homer has been fulfilling that position for his entire adult life, working in the machine that poisons his town, generating the profit that sustains the empire of the man who took his mother, never knowing the history that put him there. 3 generations of Simpsons broken by one man's grudge. Mona, who fought back and lost everything. Abe, who made the devil's bargain and buried the truth. Homer, who inherited the consequences and never understood why his life felt so heavy. And in the center of it all, Burns, who did not forget, who did not forgive, who tracked a woman across decades because she destroyed a weapons lab he had no business building in a residential neighborhood, who bought a family's silence with a job offer, who maintained his hold over an entire town through the economics of power. More precisely, it exists everywhere. Springfield, as the show has depicted it across 36 years, has mountains and oceans and deserts and farmland and forests all within accessible distance. It borders the states of Ohio, Nevada, Maine, and Kentucky, depending on which episode you're watching. It is located on the coast in certain seasons and in the landlocked heartland in others. It is near the Canadian border in some episodes and suspiciously close to Mexico in others. Its weather ranges from blizzard conditions to tropical heat waves within the span of a single season, without the show feeling any particular obligation to reconcile the meteorological inconsistency. Springfield does not exist in any state because Springfield, apparently, exists in all of them simultaneously. The show has been deliberately and systematically contradicting itself about Springfield's location for its entire run. Every time a detail appears that seems to narrow down the geographic possibilities, another detail appears in a subsequent episode that makes the previous detail impossible. Lisa's area code corresponds to a Missouri prefix. The state abbreviation has been shown in one episode as NT, which is not a real state abbreviation for any American state. When Homer calls the state capital in one episode, the voice on the other end indicates the state name begins with a vowel, which eliminates approximately half the country while doing essentially nothing to identify the actual location. Matt Groening, the show's creator, addressed this question directly in a 2012 interview with Smithsonian Magazine. He named Springfield, Oregon as the inspiration for the town's name. He said he chose Springfield because it is one of the most common city names in America, present in dozens of states, and because he grew up near the Oregon version. For approximately 48 hours, the internet accepted this as a resolution. Springfield was in Oregon. The mystery was over. And then the show continued to contradict the revelation. Episodes that aired after Groening's statement placed Springfield in geographic contexts that are inconsistent with Oregon's location on the Pacific coast. The writers did not honor the creator's confession. They kept the contradiction alive because the contradiction was the point. The surface-level explanation for this, the one the show's creators have offered, and that is accurate as far as it goes, is that Springfield is intentionally universal. It is designed to be everywhere and therefore belong to everyone. No single viewer should be able to look at Springfield and feel that it belongs exclusively to a different region of the country. The mountains make it feel Western. The ocean access makes it feel coastal. The industrial economy makes it feel Midwestern. The small-town insularity makes it feel like New England. Springfield is the platonic average of the American town, the town that everyone grew up in, regardless of their actual zip code. This is a genuine and thoughtful design philosophy, and it achieves its intended effect. Springfield does feel familiar. It does feel like a town that could be anywhere. And that universality is part of why the show has connected with such a broad audience across such a long period. But under the lens of the theories we have been exploring tonight, Springfield's geographic impossibility takes on additional dimensions that the surface explanation does not reach. If the radiation theory is correct, if the power plant has been altering the biology of every living thing in Springfield for decades, why should the physical geography of the town be exempt from contamination's distorting effects? If the people who live here can have 4 fingers and yellow skin and survive injuries that would be fatal to a normal human, if the fish have 3 eyes and the rats glow and the biological laws that govern the rest of the world have been warped by decades of nuclear exposure, why should the spatial laws that govern the physical landscape operate normally? Perhaps Springfield has both mountains and oceans in close proximity, because the contamination does not just affect biology. Perhaps it warps the physical space around the town, compressing geographic features that should be hundreds of miles apart, bending the landscape into shapes that normal geography does not permit. Springfield's impossible topography, in this reading, is not just a narrative inconsistency. It is another symptom of the same contamination that made Blinky have 3 eyes. If the coma theory is correct, Springfield's geography makes even more complete sense. Homer's unconscious mind does not contain a precise and accurate map of the United States. It contains fragments, impressions, emotional memories of places he has been or seen or heard described, mountains from a vacation he once took, ocean from a television commercial, desert from a movie, farmland from a drive through the middle of the country. The unconscious mind does not store geographic information the way a GPS system does. It stores the emotional flavor of places, the feeling of them, the way light fell in a particular location on a particular afternoon. Homer's dreaming brain assembled Springfield from every American landscape he ever encountered, layering them on top of each other without regard for geographic logic, because dreams do not have geographic logic. Dreams have emotional logic. They arrange the world according to what it felt like rather than where it physically was. Springfield feels like America because it is made from Homer's memory of America, which is scattered and incomplete and held together by longing rather than cartography. If the collective denial theory is operative, if Springfield is a town that systematically refuses to acknowledge any fact that threatens its comfortable arrangements, then the town's refusal to have a fixed location is the ultimate and most elegant expression of that denial. You cannot investigate a town you cannot find. You cannot bring federal charges against a nuclear facility if the state it is located in keeps changing. You cannot hold anyone accountable for anything if the jurisdiction is perpetually undefined and legally ambiguous. Springfield's geographic uncertainty is not just a comedy device. It is a shield. A town with no fixed location has no fixed regulatory authority, no consistent EPA jurisdiction, no permanent state attorney general empowered to investigate the facility that has been contaminating its residents for 36 years. No clarity about which court has standing to hear a case against Burns. Springfield floats between states because floating is safer than landing. Landing means accountability. Landing means someone shows up with federal authority and a mandate and starts asking questions about the three-eyed fish and the cracked cooling towers and the billionaire who claims to remember the Spanish-American War. As long as Springfield's location is contested, as long as its jurisdiction is unclear, as long as the town refuses to resolve its own geography, it is protected from exactly the kind of external intervention that would force it to confront what it has allowed to happen to its people. The episode Behind the Laughter, the 12th season mockumentary about the Simpson family, offers a moment of apparent resolution. The original broadcast of the episode identified Springfield's location as northern Kentucky. But in syndicated reruns, this was changed. The location became a different state entirely. The answer literally depends on which version of the episode you are watching. The show gave you the truth and then changed the truth depending on the platform. Even when Springfield has a definitive answer, that answer is not definitive. It shifts. It mutates. It refuses to stay fixed. Just like everything else in this town, every state in America has been proposed as Springfield's home at some point. Every theory has evidence supporting it and evidence undermining it. The show has constructed this permanent ambiguity with considerable care over a very long time. And it has maintained that ambiguity because the ambiguity is more valuable than any answer could be. A town that could be anywhere is a town that belongs to everyone. And a town that belongs to everyone is a town that nobody can shut down. Springfield will never be located, not because the show cannot decide, because the show decided long ago that the question is more useful than the answer. The mystery keeps everyone invested. The geographic impossibility keeps everyone feeling like Springfield is their town, the town they grew up near, the town they recognize from their own experience of America. But the mystery also serves another purpose, one that does not benefit the audience at all. It keeps Springfield legally unlocatable. It keeps the plant unaccountable. It keeps Burns beyond the reach of any specific regulatory body. And in Springfield, the things that keep Burns safe and the things that keep Springfield beloved have always been the same things. Section 10. The Floating Timeline. Why nobody ages and what that means. Bart Simpson was 10 years old in 1989. He is 10 years old now. Let's sit with that for a moment. 36 years have passed in the real world. 36 years of cultural change, technological transformation, generational shift, historical event, personal experience for every person who has ever watched this show. Children who watched the premiere of The Simpsons are now adults with children of their own, some of whom also watch the show. The world that existed when Bart first slid down that couch in the opening credits has been replaced, multiple times over, by a series of subsequent worlds. The technology is different, the politics are different, the music is different, the way people communicate is different. Everything that can be different is different. And Bart is still 10, Lisa is still 8, Maggie is still 1. Homer and Marge are still approximately in their mid-30s, the rough middle-aged territory the show established for them at the beginning and has never allowed them to vacate. Nobody in Springfield has aged. Nobody in Springfield has grown. The children have not gone through adolescence. The parents have not gone through middle age and into the later chapters of life that wait for everyone who survives long enough to reach them. The characters exist in a state of permanent temporal suspension. The industry term for this is a floating timeline. It means the show's present is always the viewer's present. When an episode airs in 2025, the characters are living in 2025. When an episode aired in 1995, they were living in 1995. The year changes around them. The cultural context shifts. The references update. But the characters themselves remain at the ages they were when the show began. This is standard practice for long-running animated shows. Most people accept it without examination. It's just how this kind of show works. You don't think too hard about it. You adjust your suspension of disbelief accordingly and enjoy the stories. But The Simpsons has been running long enough that the floating timeline has created something unusual. The contradictions and impossibilities that accumulate over time in any floating timeline have, in this particular show's case, reached a scale and a complexity that demands something more than casual suspension of disbelief. The show has been running for so long, with so many episodes establishing so many specific details about the characters' histories, that the floating timeline has begun to visibly buckle under the weight of its own inconsistencies. The most obvious example is the backstory problem. When the show began, Homer and Marge's history was anchored to the 1970s and early 1980s. Their teenage romance, their marriage, the birth of their children, all of it was set during that specific era. Homer's adolescence had a specific cultural flavor, one appropriate for a person in their mid-30s in the late 1980s. The music, the fashion, the cultural references all pointed to a specific historical moment. But as the floating timeline pushed the present forward decade by decade, the backstory had to move with it. If Homer and Marge are still in their mid-30s in 2025, they cannot have grown up in the 1970s. Their formative years would have been in approximately the 1990s or 2000s. Their high school experience would not have been defined by Watergate and disco. It would have been defined by grunge and the early internet. The show has handled this by simply rewriting the backstory as needed. In later seasons, flashback episodes have depicted Homer and Marge's youth in progressively more recent decades. They have been repositioned as 1990s characters, then as 2000s characters, their origin story revise, each time to maintain the fiction that they are the age the show requires them to be. Their memories are unstable. Their history is a draft that keeps being revised. The story of how they met and fell in love and built their family has been told at least 4 times, each telling set in a different era, each one rendering the previous version technically obsolete. This means something strange about who Homer and Marge actually are. They do not have a fixed past. They have an approximation of a past, a flexible narrative that can be adjusted as the timeline demands. Their identities are not rooted in stable memories. They are rooted in whatever backstory the current episode requires. And every theory we have been exploring tonight arrives at this same point, through completely different paths, and finds the same answer waiting. The coma theory says the timeline floats because the dream cannot allow time to pass. Homer's unconscious mind does not have access to the years he has been sleeping. It cannot generate memories of events it did not experience. The characters do not age because Homer's brain has only one reference point, the moment the vending machine fell, and everything it generates is derived from that single fixed image of his world. The timeline is frozen because the dreamer is frozen. The radiation theory says the timeline floats because biological time has been altered by the contamination. The cellular processes that drive aging in normal organisms have been warped by decades of nuclear exposure. The residents of Springfield are locked in their biological states not because of cartoon convention, but because their cells have lost the programming that normally drives growth and decay. The mutation that gave Blinky a third eye also gave the Simpson family permanent youth. The collective denial theory from the principal and the pauper says the timeline floats because Springfield collectively refuses to allow time to pass. The town has voted, tacitly and continuously, to maintain a fiction of permanence, to insist that things are as they have always been, to exile anyone who insists on acknowledging change. Time does not pass in Springfield because Springfield will not let it. The social contract that erased Armin Tamzarian's identity and expelled the real Seymour Skinner also erases aging. Every resident of Springfield participates in the maintenance of the permanent present. They have agreed not to notice the years. The Burns immortality theory says that if even one person in Springfield has found a way to arrest the biological clock through wealth and technology, then the concept of aging is already negotiable in this universe. Burns's refusal to age, sustained through weekly medical intervention and the application of essentially unlimited resources to the problem of biological maintenance, has established that in Springfield, time is something that can be managed if you have the means to manage it. Every single one of these explanations, using different evidence and different logic, arrives at the same conclusion. Time does not work normally in Springfield. Whether because of radiation or dreams or denial or engineered biology or some combination of all four, something has broken the normal flow of time for everyone who lives in that town. The show has imagined its characters aging, more than once. The Season 6 episode Lisa's Wedding flashes forward to show Lisa as a 23-year-old woman engaged to be married. The future it depicts is detailed and emotionally rich and entirely convincing. Lisa has grown up. She has become the person the show has always suggested she would become, brilliant and principled, and somewhat lonely and searching for real connection in a world that consistently misunderstands her. The episode proves that the show can imagine these characters as adults. It can envision their futures. It can tell stories about who they would become if time were simply allowed to pass. But it does not allow it. The flash forward is a single episode, a hypothetical, a glimpse through a window that closes the moment the credits roll. Lisa returns to being 8. Bart returns to being 10. The future is locked away, and the permanent present resumes as though the glimpse never happened. The show can imagine growth. It refuses to allow it. And this refusal is not just a production decision or a storytelling convention. It is a statement about the relationship between this show and its audience. Because the floating timeline is not just Springfield's condition. It is ours. We are the ones who built it. We are the ones who maintain it. Think about why we watch. Think about what we actually want when we sit down and turn on The Simpsons. We want the theme song. We want the couch gag. We want Homer to get home from the plant, and Marge to be in the kitchen, and Bart to be on his skateboard, and Lisa to be playing that saxophone. We want the house on Evergreen Terrace to look exactly the way it always has. We want the neighborhood to be unchanged. We want the family to be intact. We want the feeling of returning somewhere that will always be exactly as we left it. The Simpsons are the American family. They have been the American family for longer than any other fictional household in the history of the medium. And the American family, as The Simpsons depicts it, must not be allowed to change. Not because change is bad, but because the specific configuration of this particular family at this particular stage of life is what we have invested in. Homer must always be middle-aged and fumbling and fundamentally decent underneath the incompetence. Marge must always be patient and capable and slightly underappreciated. Bart must always be rebellious and smarter than he lets on. Lisa must always be idealistic and frustrated and holding out for a world that is better than the one she inhabits. Maggie must always be watching, silent, carrying whatever she carries behind those enormous eyes. The moment Bart goes to college and grows up and becomes something other than a 10-year-old with a slingshot, the show is over. Not because the stories run out, because the specific emotional need the show has been meeting for 36 years can no longer be met. Because the thing we were coming back to, week after week, year after year, is no longer there in the way it was. The floating timeline is the show's thesis statement about what it is and what we need it to be. We need The Simpsons to stay the same because they represent something we cannot afford to let age. The messy, chaotic, dysfunctional, loving, infuriating, indestructible American family. The family that survives everything, that recovers from everything, that resets after every disaster and starts fresh every Sunday evening. The family whose house always looks the same and whose kids never grow up and whose parents never stop loving each other in the particular complicated way that Homer and Marge love each other. The characters don't age because we won't let them age, because aging means ending. And the American family cannot be allowed to end, not in our imagination, not in our television, not in the dream that has been running since December 1989. There is a reading of the floating timeline that is darker than any of the theories about radiation, or comas, or collective denial. A reading that does not require any mechanism or explanation beyond the most basic human need. We pressed pause on Springfield in 1989, and we have never pressed play. We have never allowed these people to move forward into the futures they would have had if we had let time flow the way time is supposed to flow. We trapped them. We built a cage of permanence around them because we needed them to stay. Because the alternative, watching Bart Simpson grow up and move out and become whoever he was going to become without us there to see it. Watching Lisa leave home and make her compromises with the world. Watching Maggie finally speak. Watching Homer and Marge grow old together. That alternative is too much to bear. Because those futures are our futures, reflected back at us. And watching The Simpsons age would mean watching ourselves age. Watching the passage of time in a show that has always felt like home would mean acknowledging the passage of time in the world outside the screen. The loop is not their prison. The loop is ours. We built it. We maintain it. And every time we watch, every time we laugh, every time we quote a line from an episode that aired before half the current viewing audience was born, we tighten the loop a little more. We make it a little harder for The Simpsons to escape. Because if they escape, if the timeline stops floating and the characters start aging, if Bart turns 11 and Lisa turns 9 and Maggie says her second word, then the show has to end. And the show ending means admitting that 36 years have passed, that we are older, that the couch we sat on as children watching the opening credits is gone, or in storage, or in someone else's house. That the world we lived in when we first met this family has been replaced by a world those younger versions of ourselves would not entirely recognize. As long as The Simpsons is on, as long as the loop keeps floating, as long as Bart is 10 and Lisa is 8 and Homer is stumbling through the door after another day at the plant, we don't have to admit any of that. We can sit down, we can turn on the television, and we can go home to Evergreen Terrace, to Springfield, to the family that never changes, in the town that never ages, in the show that never ends. The floating timeline is the greatest magic trick The Simpsons ever pulled. Not the predictions, not the mysteries, not the theories about radiation and comas and collective denial. The magic trick is making 36 years feel like no time at all, making every episode feel like a homecoming, making a fictional family feel more stable and more permanent than anything in the actual world outside the screen. Springfield is everywhere and nowhere. The timeline floats free of any fixed moment. The family stays the same. And we keep watching because we built this place and we cannot bring ourselves to leave it. Section 11. Hans Moleman, the most frequently killed man in Springfield. His name is Hans Moleman. He is small, he is old, he is nearly blind. He wears thick glasses that reduce the world to a blur. He moves slowly. He speaks rarely. He appears in the background of Springfield scenes as a kind of ambient presence, a piece of moving furniture, a detail that fills in the edge of the frame and makes the town feel populated. And he dies constantly. This is not an exaggeration. Over the course of the show's run, Hans Moleman has been killed, by various means, a remarkable number of times. He has been struck by cars. He has been crushed by objects. He has been buried alive on multiple occasions. He has been incinerated. He has been consumed by animals. He has been struck by lightning. He has walked into traffic and been absorbed by the vehicle he did not see coming. He has been the victim of what can only be described as a comedically extraordinary run of fatal misfortune, spanning decades of episodes, in a wide variety of circumstances, each death depicted with varying degrees of explicitness, and each one followed, in the next relevant episode, by Molman appearing in the background of a different scene, intact and oblivious, ready to be killed again. The show treats this as a running gag. Molman dies a lot. It's funny, it's dark, in the casual way The Simpsons has always been dark. Don't think too hard about it, but thinking hard about it produces something genuinely strange. If Molman's deaths are canonical, if they are happening within the same Springfield where the other events of the show occur, then something about Hans Molman's biology has fundamentally deviated from normal human biology. Not in the way Homer's has, where Homer endures damage and heals through some combination of absurd toughness and narrative necessity. Molman actually dies. Clinically, terminally, completely. His body ceases to function. And then it starts again. The radiation theory has a specific and disturbing answer for this. If the contamination from the power plant creates mutations that affect different people differently, if Homer's mutation made him nearly indestructible while Maggie's amplified her intelligence, then perhaps Molman's mutation did something stranger than either. Perhaps the radiation altered Molman's biology so fundamentally that his cellular structure can reconstitute itself after catastrophic failure. Not just heal from damage, actually reassemble from death. A biological resurrection capacity, driven by whatever the plant's contamination has done to the particular configuration of his cells. The coma theory offers a different answer. In Homer's dream, minor characters are not maintained with the same consistency as major ones. The dreaming mind pays careful attention to the people it loves, and less attention to the background population it needs to keep the simulation feeling plausible. Molman, in this reading, is a dream character that Homer's unconscious mind occasionally loses track of. He dies because the dream gets sloppy with the minor details. He comes back because the dream needs him there to make the scene work. Molman is not a person in this reading. He is a recurring prop that the dream assembles and disassembles as narrative necessity requires. But here's the detail that makes the Molman mystery most interesting under any framework. Molman once stated his age. He said he was 31 years old. 31. Look at Hans Molman. He appears to be in his 70s or 80s at minimum. His skin has the particular quality of someone who has lived in a body for a very long time. His movements, his voice, his general aspect all suggest someone well into the later decades of life, not someone who has not yet reached middle age. If he is telling the truth, and the show provides no reason to think he is lying, then something aged him catastrophically and prematurely. Something took a man in the early part of his adult life and turned him into someone who looks like a very old man decades before his time. The same something that also made him capable of returning from the dead. The radiation theory accounts for this more completely than any other framework. A particular configuration of radioactive contamination could, theoretically, accelerate cellular aging in some people while providing a perverse biological resilience in others. The contamination did not age Molman normally. It did something stranger. It compressed time in his body, running his biological clock at an accelerated rate, aging him physically while simultaneously doing something to his cellular architecture that allows it to reconstitute after terminal failure. Or, as the coma theory would have it, he looks like an old man, because that is how Homer's brain imagines the background population of a small industrial town. Weary, somewhat generic. And his age of 31 is a moment of dream logic inconsistency that slipped through. Homer's unconscious mind generated a background character, assigned him a visual of elderly physical decline, and then forgot to ensure the stated age was consistent with the visual. What the Molman mystery ultimately demonstrates is the show's remarkable capacity for hiding genuine strangeness inside what looks like simple comedy. The joke is, this man keeps dying. The reality underneath the joke is, this man cannot die. Something in Springfield has made death, for at least one resident, a temporary condition, a revolving door rather than a permanent exit, and nobody in town has noticed. Nobody has filed a report. Nobody has asked the medical community to examine a man who dies and returns on a regular basis. Nobody has done anything except step around the body when it appears and return to their lives. Because in Springfield, you step around what you cannot explain. That is the social contract. That is the vote that the town keeps taking in every episode, every time something impossible happens and gets absorbed into the background and forgotten. Hans Moleman dies. Springfield steps around him. And the next episode, he's there again, ready to step in front of the next car. Section 12. Ned Flanders and the Architecture of Performed Goodness. There is a man who lives next door to Homer Simpson, and he is the character the show has most quietly and most thoroughly destroyed. Ned Flanders. On the surface, Ned is everything. Homer is not. He is kind, he is patient, he is devoutly religious in a way that informs every choice he makes. He is physically fit. He is financially responsible. He is a good father to his sons, Rod and Todd. He is a good neighbor to Ha and Homer. Despite everything Homer has done and continues to do, he is generous to a fault. He loans tools and food and emotional support to the people around him without expectation of return. By any objective measure, by any ethical framework you care to apply, Ned Flanders is a better person than Homer Simpson in essentially every dimension you could examine. And the show punishes him for it, relentlessly, comprehensively, without mercy and without end. Ned's wife Maud was killed. She did not die from illness or old age or any natural cause. She was struck by a t-shirt fired from a promotional cannon at a NASCAR event. The cannon fired because Homer, sitting in the bleachers, was dodging the shirts. He stepped aside. Maud was hit. She fell from the bleachers and died. Homer's selfishness, his reflexive prioritization of his own comfort over any awareness of what his actions might mean for the people around him, directly and causally killed the woman that Ned loved. Ned forgave him. Because that is what Ned does. That is all Ned does, apparently. He forgives. He turns the other cheek. He absorbs the consequences of living next door to Homer Simpson and responds with grace and patience and the particular serenity of a man who is committed to the belief that God has a plan and that the plan is good even when its goodness is not immediately legible. But fans noticed, over many seasons, that the serenity had cracks in it. Moments when the patience frayed. Moments when something beneath the cheerful exterior pressed against the surface and threatened to break through. And in one of the show's most psychologically rich episodes, the facade comes down completely. A hurricane destroys Ned's house. The community rallies to help. Everyone in Springfield comes out to rebuild. And they build it badly. They build it with the enthusiasm and incompetence of people who mean well but do not know what they are doing. The house collapses. And Ned, standing in front of the ruin of his home with the evidence of everyone's well-intentioned failure spread around him, breaks. He starts shouting. He names every person who has ever wronged him. He says the things he has been holding inside for decades, the accumulated resentment and frustration and pain of a man who has been subjected to loss after loss after loss, while maintaining a performance of uncomplaining acceptance. And then he is institutionalized. He is committed to a mental health facility. And there, the episode reveals something that recontextualizes everything about Ned Flanders that came before it. His kindness is not natural. It is not an authentic expression of his character. It is the product of childhood behavioral modification. Ned was a difficult child, uncontrollable, violent in the way that certain children are violent. Not from malice, but from an excess of energy and aggression that had no healthy outlet and no parental structure to channel it. His parents, committed to a particular philosophical approach to child rearing that did not include discipline, took him to a psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist spent years conditioning the aggression out of him. He reprogrammed Ned's emotional responses, modifying his psychological architecture until the rage was buried under such deep layers of behavioral conditioning that it could not surface under normal circumstances. The result was Ned Flanders as we know him, patient, kind, generous, incapable of expressing anger. But the rage did not disappear. It was suppressed, not removed. It is still there underneath the conditioning, waiting for the moment when the layers of behavioral modification are stripped away by sufficient stress. The hurricane stripped those layers away. And what was underneath was not the saintly neighbor. It was the original child, the one who was sent to the psychiatrist because nobody could handle him. Ned's kindness is not a virtue. It is a cage. Built around a person who was never given the chance to become himself, constructed by adults who found his authentic self inconvenient and replaced it with a performance of goodness that could be sustained as long as conditions stayed within certain parameters. Everything about Ned's life reads differently once you understand this. His patience with Homer is not saintly grace. It is the conditioned response of someone whose nervous system was rewired to prevent the expression of anger, regardless of how much anger is justified. He cannot be angry at Homer even when Homer kills his wife, because the capacity to express that anger was removed from him before he was old enough to understand what was being taken. His faith is not spiritual conviction in any simple sense. It is the scaffolding around a psychological architecture that would collapse without it. Ned needs God to have a plan because the alternative, that the suffering is random and the losses are meaningless and the performance of goodness leads nowhere, is more than the conditioning can absorb. His faith is functional. It is doing the work that the behavioral modification requires it to do, providing an explanatory framework that makes ongoing compliance with the performance possible. And God does not speak to Ned. This is perhaps the show's cruelest detail and the most theologically pointed. In the same universe where God appears to Homer Simpson for direct conversations on multiple occasions, in the same Springfield where Homer gets divine dialogue in at least 2 separate episodes, God is silent when it comes to the man who has dedicated his life to faith. The drunk who sleeps through church gets FaceTime with the divine. The devout man who never misses a Sunday gets nothing. This is not an accident. This is the show making a specific theological statement that is darker than anything the show usually says explicitly. Goodness is not rewarded. Compliance is not protected. The system, whether that system is Burns's economic machine or the town's social contract, or the actual cosmological framework of the Simpsons universe, does not care about moral behavior. It cares about function. And Ned functions exactly as the system requires, absorbing Homer's chaos, forgiving Homer's damage, maintaining the neighborhood's social equilibrium by never retaliating, never escalating, never demanding the accountability that Homer's behavior consistently deserves. Ned is useful. God is talking to Homer, not to Ned, because Homer is the story and Ned is the context. Ned is the moral background against which Homer's choices are made legible. Homer's flaws are visible because Ned is there to contrast them. Homer's occasional goodness means something because Ned's consistent goodness is there to show us the standard. Ned is not the protagonist of any story. He is the measuring stick by which the protagonist is judged. And the measuring stick, as it turns out, is broken. Ned Flanders is the saddest character on The Simpsons. Not Homer, who is too cognitively impaired to fully comprehend the architecture of his own suffering. Not Lisa, who is young enough to still believe that things might improve, that the world might eventually become capable of understanding her. Not Burns, who is too powerful and too insulated to experience anything that could meaningfully be called suffering in any recognizable sense. Ned Flanders, the man who does everything right and receives nothing for it. The man whose wife was killed by his neighbor's reflexes and who responded with forgiveness because his nervous system was conditioned to prevent any other response. The man who goes to his church every Sunday and prays to a God who has spoken to the wrong man and maintained silence with the right one. Ned and Homer have been neighbors for 36 years. They have lived their parallel lives on the same street, in the same town, close enough to see into each other's windows, far enough apart to maintain the fiction that they inhabit the same kind of existence. They do not. The gap between them, between the man who tries and the man who cannot manage to try very effectively, has never closed. It was never going to close. Because the system that produces Homer is the same system that produces Ned. The radiation, or the dreams, or the collective denial, or Burns's machinery of exploitation, whatever is operating in Springfield requires both of them. It requires Homer at the plant and Ned at the church, and Burns at the top, each in their assigned position, each serving the function the system needs them to serve. Springfield is a closed system. Everything inside it serves a purpose. The chaos serves the order. The goodness serves the machine that does not reward it. And the man next door keeps waving across the fence and calling his neighbor a good neighbor, despite everything that neighbor has done and never stopped doing. Because that is what the conditioning requires. Because the alternative is another hurricane, another breakdown, another moment when the cage breaks and the original person inside it, the one who was sent to the psychiatrist because no one could handle him, gets out. And Springfield has decided that version of Ned Flanders is not allowed to exist. Closing. We have spent a long time in Springfield tonight, moving slowly through it, looking at the corners that usually stay dark, the details that usually get absorbed into the background, the questions that the show asks and then carefully declines to answer. We followed the radioactive contamination from the plant to the people. From the three-eyed fish to the yellow skin and the four fingers, from the broken safety inspector to the brilliant baby, from the cracked cooling towers to the compromised brains that cannot trace the damage back to its source. We lay down in Homer's hospital bed and considered the possibility that everything since April 1993 has been a dream. That the man we have watched stumble through adventure after impossible adventure has been unconscious the whole time, dreaming the only dream that matters to him. His family, his house, his life exactly as it was the last moment he was awake to experience it. We reopened the Burns shooting case and found that the evidence, examined carefully and honestly, points in multiple directions at once. We considered Maggie's pacifier gesture and asked whether it was a confession or a witness's memory. We noted Homer's unexamined Season 18 statement. We considered Marge and what Burns's courtship of her might have meant in the parking lot. We left the case where it belongs, not closed, but open. We examined the machinery that keeps Burns alive, the weekly treatments, the disease equilibrium, the devoted assistant who understands that his absence means his employer's death. We traced Burns's longevity back through American history to a family dynasty that has been maintaining power through extraordinary measures for longer than most American institutions have existed. We watched Springfield vote to keep a lie. We watched the real Seymour Skinner tied to a train and expelled from his own life. We identified the mechanism by which the town maintains its impossible reality, through consensus, through denial, through the systematic removal of anyone who insists on the truth. We looked behind Maggie's silence and found a strategic intelligence that has spent 36 years accumulating information and declining to reveal what it will eventually do with it. We connected her silence to Lisa's experience and understood the lesson Maggie took from watching her sister fight every day for recognition she never quite received. We examined the predictions and concluded that The Simpsons does not see the future. It reads the present more carefully than most people do and then pushes it forward until the destination becomes visible. And that America has been shaped by The Simpsons' vision of it as much as The Simpsons has been shaped by America. Springfield and America have been mirroring each other for so long that the distinction has become difficult to see. We followed Mona Simpson's trail from a suburban kitchen in Springfield to a biological weapons raid in 1969 to 27 years of fugitive life to a reunion beside the wrong gravestone. We traced the 3 generations of damage that one man's grudge produced. We watched Homer return to the plant the morning after learning who destroyed his family, because he could not make the connection, because the damage that was done to him also destroyed the tools he would need to understand it. We looked for Springfield on a map and found it everywhere. In the mountains and on the coast and in the heartland and near the border and nowhere specific enough to pin down. We understood that the town's geographic impossibility serves a purpose. That the inability to locate it precisely is also the inability to regulate it precisely. That the floating geography protects the plant the same way the collective denial protects the truth about what the plant has done. And we stared at the floating timeline, at 36 years of Bart being 10 and Lisa being 8, and Homer being middle-aged and Marge being patient. We understood that the loop is not broken. It is maintained. By us. By the need to return to something that does not change in a world where everything does. We met Hans Moleman and watched him die and come back and die again. And we understood that even death is negotiable in this town. Even the most permanent fact of biological existence bends in Springfield when the radiation, or the dream, or the denial requires it to. We sat with Ned Flanders and understood the cost of a life spent performing goodness for a system that does not reward goodness, only function. We understood the cage that was built around the original person and why the cage is more useful to Springfield than the person inside it would be. Every theory we explored tonight is different. Every one of them uses different evidence, different logic, different assumptions about what The Simpsons is and what it has been trying to say for 36 years. But every single one of them arrives at the same conclusion. Something is wrong in Springfield. Something structural. Something that goes deeper than animation style or episodic storytelling convention or cartoon logic. Whether the explanation is radiation or dreams or denial or institutional corruption, or the accumulated weight of 36 years of jokes and callbacks and unanswered questions, something has broken the ordinary rules of reality in this town. And the show has been telling us about it since the very first episode, not through exposition or dramatic reveal, through accumulation. Through the patient, persistent layering of detail upon detail until the picture becomes undeniable for anyone willing to look at it. The Simpsons is not hiding its mysteries. It is showing them every single week, placing them carefully in the frame and trusting that someone will eventually stop and look at them with fresh eyes. The reason most people don't see them is not that the clues are hidden. It is that we have become Springfield. We have watched long enough that the yellow skin and the four fingers and the ageless children and the immortal billionaire and the town that forgets every catastrophe have all become normal. We have absorbed the visual grammar of this impossible place and stopped questioning it. We look at a three-eyed fish and think, well, that's just how things are around here. But they don't have to be. The theories exist because some people looked at Springfield and refused to accept the surface. They sat still, with the details long enough to notice the patterns underneath them. And what they found is a version of Springfield that is stranger and sadder and more beautiful than the one the show presents at face value. A version where Homer's simplicity is a wound left by a system that broke him before he understood what was happening. Where Maggie's silence is the cleverest thing anyone in the family has ever done. Where Burns's immortality is the logical and terrifying conclusion of wealth that has never been asked to stop accumulating. Where Marge's patience is the only thing keeping the entire fragile structure from collapsing. Where Bart's defiance is the only sane response to a world that has stopped making sense. And where Lisa, 8 years old and brilliant and alone, keeps asking questions that nobody wants to hear because she is the only one who has not stopped looking. That is The Simpsons. 36 seasons, 788 episodes, the longest-running animated series in American history. The most analyzed, most theorized, most carefully examined show ever produced. And after all of it, after all the theories and all the evidence and all the hours spent trying to understand what it has been saying underneath the jokes, the biggest mystery is still the simplest one. Why can't we let them go? Maybe because they're us. Maybe because Springfield is our town, the town we came from, or the town we were afraid we came from, or the town that feels like what America actually is underneath the version it tells itself about itself. Maybe Homer is our father, the man who means well and fails regularly and keeps trying anyway. Maybe Marge is our mother, holding everything together so quietly that we only notice the architecture when it threatens to fall. Maybe Bart is who we wanted to be before we learned that certain things are not allowed. And maybe Lisa is who we knew we should be but could never quite manage because the gap between the person we wanted to become and the world we actually inhabited was too wide and too cold to cross. Maybe Maggie is the version of ourselves we keep hidden. The intelligence and the capability and the perception that we learned early to keep quiet. The part of us that watches everything and processes everything and says nothing, because we saw what happens to the people who speak too soon in rooms, that are not ready to hear them. Or maybe it is simpler than that. Maybe we cannot let them go because letting them go means admitting that 36 years have passed, that we are older now, that the world has changed in ways that are not entirely reversible, that the couch we sat on as children watching the opening credits is gone or different or occupied by someone else entirely. And as long as The Simpsons is on, as long as the loop keeps floating, as long as Bart is 10 and Lisa is 8 and Homer is stumbling through his front door at the end of another impossible day, We do not have to admit any of that. We can sit down. We can turn on the television. We can go home. To Evergreen Terrace. To Springfield. To the family that never changes, in the town that never ages, in the show that never ends. Thank you for spending 4 hours in Springfield with me tonight. Whatever time it is where you are, whatever part of the world you're drifting off in, I hope it was a good journey. Springfield will be here when you come back, it always is. That's the whole point.